Hello, I'm International Master Andrew Martin, and I'd like to welcome you to this Foxy Openings DVD on the Lion. The Lion opening, that's one e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, and the characteristic move e5, gets its name from two Dutch amateur players, Jansen and Van Reekom, who wrote a lengthy book on the subject, which has since been reprinted by New in Chess. Basically, the Lion is an attempt by black to get an improved Philidor, so I suppose they had to call it something original. Now, I remember looking at this massive book with an enormous amount of analysis and thinking, can it really be that difficult to play black's position? I mean, there's no doubt that the move order that black employs above has merit. White is forced away from some awkward variations of the Philidor from black's point of view and asked to make difficult decisions early. To play the Lion, you need patience, reasonable technique and a flair for counter-attack. And with those qualities in place, there is no reason why you should not use the Lion successfully. Now, I've tried to make life as easy as possible for the viewer on this DVD, and I'm going to break it down into three separate sections. The first section features the endgame after d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8 check, and now king takes d8. Well, perhaps this should be renamed the Pussycat variation rather than the Lion, because the game looks a bit dry. But black scores surprisingly well from this position at all levels, as white often doesn't know what to do with his minimal advantage, throws it away and drifts into a bad game. In the second section, going back to e5, we look at other white second moves apart from knight f3, such as the dangerous looking f4 or knight ge2. But in fact, white's fourth move alternatives are quite limited, due to black's forcing idea of e takes d4, bringing out white's queen into the game, followed by knight c6. In the third section, we go on to looking at what I consider to be white's best fourth move, that's the simple knight f3, which will almost certainly transpose to the Philidor after knight bd7, bishop c4, and then bishop e7. And we're going to consider black's most modern interpretation of this ancient opening, which is popular with many leading grandmasters today, who have recognised the counter-attacking potential of the black position. One small point before I leave this intro: if we consider the Philidor move order direct, that's e5 first, then d6, and only now knight f6, we note the difference that the white knight isn't on c3. This gives white the opportunity to play d takes e5, and after knight takes e4, there are two variations which I think are a little bit awkward for black to meet. Firstly, knight bd2. I don't see any way really of black to avoid a slight disadvantage in that line. And going back to knight takes e4, the dangerous tactical move, queen to d5. And basically by employing the Lion move order, we avoid these variations altogether. Okay, well that is the introduction. Now it's time to get on with the show and see if we can make black's idea work. Well, before we get into the bulk of any theory that exists on the Lion, I want to show you an inspiring game. This comes from a Spanish Open tournament in 1997. Playing white is Grandmaster de la Villa Garcia, and playing black is Grandmaster Juric. And the opening is a little bit fiddly, because on black's third move, Juric plays knight bd7 in place of our e5. Now this only makes a difference when white plays f4. I don't recommend this particular move order for black. I think that f4 gives white some chances, whether black plays e5 or not, some dangerous attacking chances, and I want to avoid all those attacking ideas by playing 3e5. As we'll see, this is an improved way of handling the Lion for black, in my opinion. Anyway, going back to the game de la Villa Garcia Juric, on that day white decided to play f3, a stable move supporting the centre, preparing bishop e3. And this sort of setup by white is used commonly these days against all manner of black defensive systems. It's used against the Sicilian a lot, it's used against the Perk Modern a lot, it's used against the King's Indian. Of course there it will be called the same-ish system. The pawn on f3 gives the white centre a rock-like quality, and this white hopes will enable him to continue his attacking build-up unhindered. Now the nice thing about the Lion, or the Philidor, let's call it the Philidor because that's what it is. The nice thing about the Philidor is that black gets a very compact formation early, a very solid defence. He castles, and now the key move coming up, pawn up to c6. And this is the first sign that black intends to get some counterplay. The move c6 prepares b5, and necessarily, in certain cases, covers the d5 square. If there's a slight drawback to white's setup, it must be that it's a little bit slow. Nevertheless, white is thinking about casting on the queen side, and that's exactly what Garcia did, and maybe launching some sort of dangerous kingside pawn storm with g4 and h4. Well, this is all very well and good. Just see what happens in this game, because black got to work straight away with b5. Alright, white played king b1. A typical safety move in such circumstances. I wonder whether there was a need, an urgent need to actually play this move in this position. It could be interpreted as a waste of a move, actually. Anyway, black wasn't too bothered by king b1. He just played queen to c7, and now white played knight to g3. First sign that white has attacking intentions. Maybe he's threatening to bring that knight into f5, which would embarrass the position of the bishop on e7. And here we see a slight drawback of the Philidor move order as opposed to the Pirc modern move order. There, of course, black would already have a pawn on g6, and that would, of course, stop the white knight from coming into f5. Well, okay, black just carries on, knight to b6. As we can see, solid control over c4 and d5, and who knows, black might be thinking about playing knight c4. If black was allowed to play knight c4, then white would probably have to take that. Black recaptures with the b pawn, and with the b file opening up, there could be some pressure coming against the white king. Let's just show you what I mean. Let's say white plays a move like h4 here. Okay, black brings his knight in, white probably has to take that. Black recaptures, and now there's a very quick black attack coming with rook b8. So going back to the game, after knight b6, this is why white decides to play b3. Although that is another move I say I do not like. White's played a couple of moves here, king b1 and b3, which actually in the long run only help black. For instance, Jurich played b4, good move, knight drops back to e2 necessarily, and now c5, d takes e5, d takes e5, and white suddenly saw that, well, black was probably threatening c4 in this position. The move b3 has actually helped black to get to grips with the white king. So I'm not at all sure about b3, although it did, of course, cut the black knight out of c4. And we can quickly see that if we take one glance at this position, the black attacker is actually quicker than white here. Alright, well, white decided to play c4, another move on the queen side he wouldn't have wanted to have made. Quite a common feature of these types of position is the potentially poor white light square bishop on f1. Another white pawn goes onto a light square, and now there are often endgame positions where that bishop becomes a liability. This is a common theme in the line. We will see it certainly cropping up a lot in the endgame section, and white's got to be a bit careful here that he doesn't get very poor endgames with that bishop locked in behind the pawn chain. Anyway, Jurich isn't thinking about the endgame at the moment. He's thinking about the end of the game, and that's why he sticks his pawn up on a5. And white, black's plan is obvious. a4, open up the a file, get the queen in, down to a1, and checkmate will follow shortly. Well, white went knight 5. Alright, not to lose time, black took it off. Rook fd8, queen c2, rook takes d1, queen takes d1, and I think black played this way because he wanted to keep the option of rook d8 available, which would take the d file by force. However, although that is a good move in this position, black decided to press ahead with a4, and who can blame him? Of course, what is immediately obvious is that white's attack on the king side is stillborn, whereas the black attack is in full swing. And, well, I'm not even sure that it can be stopped at this stage. White has played so slowly. Well, white brought another piece back to the defence, bishop c1. I think this is possibly a game that Garcia would have wanted to have forgotten. But of course, if a grandmaster can play in this manner, so can your opponents. Never forget that. Even the best players can be surprised or have an off day, or just simply not come to terms with the demands of the position. And here, white has just made far too many defensive moves. Well, e4. open up the game when you're ahead in development, and that's exactly what black is trying to do. He's creating an avenue for the queen to come into the game, possibly on e5, after which the pawn on f5 starts to look very sick indeed. White moved to let his bishop out, and after that perhaps the rook on h1 with knight g3. Black opened up the a file. The black attack runs on oiled wheels, and now the excellent move bishop to d6, sacrificing a pawn, but in return black gets a wonderful square for the bishop on e5, gazing all the way down to the white king. And well, of course, the problem for white in this position is he can't play bishop b2. If he does that, black's happy to take the bishop, and then queen a7 or queen e5 look totally disastrous for white. And please note that bishop on f1, locked in behind the pawn chain. It really is a hopeless piece. So basically it all ends up for white. I mean, I don't think he can defend himself here. He tried queen d3, bishop dropped back to f6, making room for the queen, bishop e2, and now black has a choice between queen e5 and queen a7. And once white had seen that move, that was enough for him. Time to resign. If he tries to do a runner with king to c2, black simply brings his queen down, and then there are many good moves here, but I'm sure rook d8 is probably the best of them. So white resigned. A total disaster for white, but that gives you an indication how quick the black attack can be if white's play is only even slightly hesitant. And you don't often see a grandmaster demolished in this manner. Okay, well, in the last game, of course, we saw a flash of inspiration from black. This time we're going to see perspiration from both players as we head into the endgame after d takes e5 and then queen takes d8, king takes d8. Well, perhaps it's more correct to call it a queenless middle game. It's not an endgame yet, but it could easily become an endgame very quickly. And at the outset, in this position, black is very slightly worse. It's not a prospectless barren position, black completely barren, because black has won quite a few games from this position. And the way he generally wins is to, first of all, patiently neutralise the slight white initiative. And after that, he aims to control dark squares. As you can see, black's central pawn is already controlling two nice dark squares on f4 and d4. Black would very much like to exchange off dark square bishops in this endgame and establish his knights on the dark squares. White, for his part, well, white's got to be very careful that simplified positions don't arise where he is left with a bad white square bishop. Note that his central pawn is fixed on a light square, so traditionally the bishop on f1, well, it can't be called bad, but it's definitely white's worst bishop. So white wants to avoid endgames where this bishop stays on the board, for instance endgames with a good black knight against this dodgy bishop. So there are quite a few things to play for in this endgame. Patience is required, and an eye for counterplay. So here comes the game Klimov versus Lugovoy, played in St. Petersburg, 2005, where white played the very plausible move bishop g5. And the idea of that is to castle on the queen side as quickly as possible, bringing the rook into play. Well, after that, I think black played correctly, bishop e6. That prevents bishop c4 for good. White castled, and now black put his knight in the way. So black has completed his initial development. Next comes moves like c6, king c7 and bishop c5, followed by development of the rooks. So seeing this, Klimov moved to intercept that idea with the immediate f4. Now if you think about it, there are very few ways that white can put immediate pressure on black in this position. I suppose one of them would be to play knight to f3 with the threat of knight takes e5. After that, I think black's got to basically just pause for an instant with king c8, and then we see that actually the white position lacks a little bit of punch here, because although the knights come to what looks like a decent square on f3, there's no real way to follow that move up. For instance, if white plays knight d2 in this position, perhaps intending bishop c4, then black simply plays bishop c5. And after a move f3, black plays c6. And with king c7 to come, black is okay. Going back to the position after knight bd7, g3 has been played, and after king c8, f4 looks like a dangerous try. Well, I'm not sure. and I think h6 is actually quite reasonable for black. For instance, in the game Kiselev versus Moldovan, Bucharest 1993, white tried f5. Black took on g5, white captured on e6, black recaptured, and now white put his bishop out on c4. Well, g4 happened, bishop takes e6, pawn up to c6, knight ge2, king c7, this is the saving grace, and now after h3 white offered a draw. This is not at all an unreasonable offer. Opposite colour bishops are on the board. The pawn at e5 is actually very strong because it restricts the knight on e2, and if black simply takes on h3, rook takes h3, rook takes h3, bishop takes h3, bishop c5, gives black easy equality. There's no real reason why, you know, either player should agree to a draw in this position. If you're the stronger player with black, you can easily play on with, for instance, ideas of rook h8 and then rook h2. Black can play on in this position. It's not a complete draw. However, on that day, the two players decided to shake hands. Going back to the position after h6, in the game Melado Trivino versus Campora, Grandmaster Campora, Leon 1997, white tried bishop h4. But he was shocked, no doubt, after g5, f takes g5, and now knight g4, when black starts to create very dangerous threats on e3 and f2. Should white play knight h3 in this position, then black has some interesting ideas involving simply bishop e7, and knight e3 is also a possibility. So black is perfectly okay after g3. That's why, going back to our featured game, white decided to play f4. But when black takes that, again white doesn't have an especially great follow-up. For instance, if he plays knight ge2, black plays bishop c6, knight takes f4, and now comes the key move h6. And the point of this is if white takes on e6, we get a typical endgame position arising where the pawn on e6 is covering very important central squares. And after king e7, let's say bishop d3, pawn to a6, keeping the white knight out of b5, h3, keeping the black knight out of g4, because black was menacing moves like g5 and then knight g4. Well, black just goes rook hf8. And now we see that black's control of the dark squares, e5 and f4, outweighs the white bishop pair. In particular, that bishop on d3 is not especially impressive. So black is perfectly okay in this position as well, which is why, after he takes f4 in the game, Klimov decided to play knight f3. Okay, black freed up his knights with king c8, and now bishop takes f4 was answered by bishop c5. A nice active location for the bishop, and well, again, black has ideas of knight to g4. This is the type of thing that white has to worry about in endgames of this type. And whilst white has played f4, he's also cleared the e5 square. So this would be a very nice square for black to be able to station a knight on as the game progresses. Well, okay, white did not like the idea of a black knight appearing on g4, so he played h3. In the game Weisse versus Rousis, played in France in 1992, white tried the immediate e5, allowing knight g4, and then he played knight e4 to stop knight f2. Bishop e3 happened. There was an exchange of dark squared bishop, which in principle favours black. White went rook e1, knight takes on f1, rook h takes on f1, and now a very good move by black, king d8, intending to answer knight eg5 with king e7 and complete equality, which takes us back to bishop c5, and Klimov played h3. Alright, knight h5, excellent move. Bishop drops back to h2, bishop e3 check, and now black offering the exchange of dark square bishops once again with bishop f4. And in this position it's an exchange that white can scarcely avoid. It's interesting that actually white is not making any use at all of the open d file in this position. Far more important is the weakness of his dark squares. Well, g4, bishop takes h2, and now the knight slotted in very comfortably to f4. and white played a very plausible move here, rook hd2. Okay, this optically looks very strong. Perhaps rook f2 would have been better, and after that I think c6 would be answered by knight d4, and now black plays g5. White should try and get rid of that strong knight on f4. Knight takes e2, bishop takes e2, and now I think rook f8 would be in order. For instance, if white plays knight takes e6, f takes e6, rook takes f8, knight takes f8, rook comes to f1, and now king c7, rook f7, king comes out to b6, and black is okay in this position. He's got a slightly more active king, and the rook is coming to d8. Going back to the game, we rejoin 2500 rated Sergei Klimov playing rook hd2, and now black played a key move, c6. Basically that keeps a white knight out of d5 and prepares king c7. White tried to put a bit of pressure on with knight g5, threatening knight takes bishop and then rook takes d7, but black played knight e5. And now we see a more or less ideal position for black in this line, where he's managed to establish his knights on the dark squares, and he's ready now for moves like king c7 and rooks to the centre, after which black will be immediately slightly better because of the weak white e-pawn. And please note, white is yet to get rid of that bad bishop on f1. Rook comes to f2, f6, excellent move, so that if rook takes f4, we take on g5, rook f2, king c7. Slight advantage to black, better bishop, superb knight, rook to f8 coming, and after that dark square control. Not a winning advantage for black by any means, but certainly black is better in this position. So back at the game, after f6, white decided to try and exchange off that powerful knight on e5 by playing knight f3. Black was happy to exchange, and now he brought his other knight around to g6, intending perhaps knight e5 in the upcoming play. White went knight e2, black felt it was time to get his king into the game, knight came to d4, and rook a e8. So still very traditional play in this type of endgame. The key to this position is understanding that black has very important dark square control on e5 and f4, and that's actually stopping white from doing anything. Alright, knight comes to f5. Black temporises for the time being with rook hg8. White plays rook f2, and now the knight hops into that beautiful square, which of course gives black the extra option of playing g6 if he needs it. Bishop e2, rook d8, another excellent move. Black is not afraid of rook takes d8 in this position. After that, he intends to recapture with his king, and if h4, now the idea is revealed. Black intends to go g6, so that if knight d6 in this position, black has king c7 and everything is defended. Meanwhile, if knight e3, black has king e7, and once again we see the black king and black rook taking up slightly more influential positions, and in this position actually black's threatening rook d4. If white goes c3, in comes the knight, rook f1, knight comes back, bishop f3 protecting, and in comes the rook, with a definite advantage to black after knight d1 and now knight d7. All the black pieces are taking up active positions. In fact, well, I think white is in a very bad state in this position due to black's idea of knight e5 and then the rook invading on the king side. So you can see, I hope, from this analysis that, you know, these types of endings do contain more than a drop of poison for the unwary. And, well, Klimov is simply drifting into a poor position. He played rook f1. Black was happy to exchange the rooks and then get rid of the powerful white knight. Knight dropped back centrally, and now rook d8. And it's hard to imagine that, you know, black is going to win this position, but in fact he wraps up this game with the help of a white mistake, admittedly, in a few more moves. Although it has to be said, after rook takes, king takes, black has very superior prospects in this endgame. Now let me just detail the reasons why once more. His pieces are much better placed than the white pieces. The knight on e5 is a giant, and white's got this crummy bishop looking at 3 pawns on the same colour square as itself. Black's king is close to the centre. Black also has 2 pawn islands to white's 3 pawn islands. Pawn islands are groups of pawns. So I'm marking the 3 pawn islands that white has in red and the 2 pawn islands that black has in yellow. Generally, in endgames, the player with the fewer pawn islands has the better position, the inherently sounder position. How can I put it? So black's got everything to play for in this endgame. And, well, I suppose white played a3, a purely defensive move, intending to activate his king. He doesn't want to be worried by ideas of bishop takes a2. So black brought up his king 2. There was a little bit of regrouping. Knight comes back to f7. Knight goes to d1. And now I think black plays the second best move. I think f5 perhaps should have been prefaced by improving the king. I think black should have brought his king to e5 before playing f5. This was better timing. And despite the fact that he's giving white the opportunity to exchange off a couple of pairs of pawns, which doesn't exactly make his bishop worse, the problem for white is that at the end of this exchanging mechanism, what we actually get is a position where the black knight and the black king are still in much better positions than the white pieces. You know, it's not what has left the board, it's what remains on it that counts. And white is still nursing 3 pawn islands in this position, and his pieces are worse. I'm not saying this position is winning for black, but white has a tough defence on his hands. Alright, well anyway, f5 worked a treat in the game, because after e takes f5, g takes f5, knight e3, f takes g4, knight takes g4, black played knight g5, and now came a mistake, prompted perhaps by time trouble. Knight f2. Black took on h3, of course, winning a pawn in clear daylight. Going back, h4 is the only move, but I think still black maintains advantage after knight e4, bishop f3, knight d6, knight e3, king f6, and once again we see black bringing his king into the centre with an obvious advantage. However, the game would have continued in that instance, and white is not necessarily lost, although he again faces a very difficult and protracted defence. Going back to the game though, and knight f2, this was obviously disastrous. Knight takes h3, and I'm pretty sure that Klimov was in desperate time trouble, otherwise he wouldn't have allowed that capture. And I've just got 0-1 on my score sheet, which could mean one of two things. Either he was so shell-shocked by this capture that he decided to resign straight away. I mean, after all, Lugavoy is 25-50. Or he lost on time. I consider the latter possibility more likely. Of course, now it's absolutely lost. If white takes, bishop takes, black is an extra passed pawn up. He's still got the better king. I imagine the king would wander up to g5. The pawn will start trundling down the board. And the important thing to notice is the queening square is the same colour as the black bishop. So all these three things combined mean that the white position is lost. Okay, white resigned. So that was an interesting game in all its phases. A queenless middle game, yes, but certainly not lacking in interest. And there's a lot of chess to be played in this endgame, as you will see. My summary of bishop g5, going back, is that the move is less dangerous than it looks. Yes, it does put black under initial pressure, but after bishop e6 and then knight bd7 followed by c6, king c7 and bishop c5, if black can get in those moves, black successfully negates white's minimal initiative. It's the FIDE World Cup knockout tournament in the year 2000. Playing white is Barayev, who was at that time graded over 2700, and playing black, a long-time defender of the black cause in this particular setup, Zurab Azmayparashvili. And, well, Barayev took the pawn, took the queens, and now played bishop c4, which in my view is a very natural move. I think this will crop up routinely in your games if you play this system with any regularity. And black basically has two moves in this position. Now, in our game, Barayev versus Azmayparashvili, I think black played the best move here, king e8. But bishop e6 has been surprisingly popular. I'm not sure I understand that. Admittedly, after bishop takes e6, f takes e6, the double black central pawns do control a lot of squares. But hasn't black just encouraged white to exchange off his worst bishop there? So I think king e8 is actually a lot more logical, and it's the move as Myprashvili played. Okay, the king will be slightly more vulnerable in the centre than it would be, for instance, on c7, but nevertheless, as Myprashvili has scored well with this move, and as we'll see, goes on to beat Barayev. So Barayev played knight f3, black brought his bishop out to d6 to protect the pawn, and now white played bishop g5. So it's easy to see that the white pieces are streaming out, white is maintaining his very small edge. Two other Myprashvili games provide a clue as to what might happen after, for instance, castles in this position, as played in the game Godena versus Myprashvili in 2000. Well, there black played a6. This seems to be a fairly thematic idea with two reasons behind it. Black's thinking about b5. He also cuts the white knight out of b5, which would embarrass the position of the bishop on d6. Godena played a4, and now knight c6. One reason for delaying the move c6 might be to put the actual knight on that square. White tried to move in with knight g5, and then knight d5. But his temporary initiative was snuffed out after knight takes, bishop takes d5, f6, repelling the knight, and now bishop e6. Okay, slightly paradoxical in the sense that, yes, black is allowing white to exchange off his bad bishop, but this is a fairly simplified position, and after king e7 it was dead level. Black is absolutely fine. He's going to bring a rook to the d file. He's going to answer knight h4 with g6. Going back to the position after bishop d6, in Hodgson as Myprashvili played in Vaiken bishop e3 was played, and once again black played a6. After a4, a peculiar look move, bishop d7 was played. After knight g5, rook f8, knight came to d5, knight takes d5 happened, bishop takes d5, c6. Incidentally, knight c6 was also a decent move. c6, bishop b3, h6 repelling borders, castles on the queen side, and after bishop c7, black had a safe position. Well, anyway, back at Barayev as Myprashvili, black decided to play bishop g5. White, excuse me. And knight bd7 was played. Also possible after bishop g5 is c6, intending to answer castles with bishop c7, and then h3 with knight bd7. Please note, going back to bishop c7, that bishop takes f6, g takes f6 is a less than appetising capture for white. White doesn't really have any logical follow-up to that move. He could play, for instance, a move like knight h4, but then black plays bishop e6 with all bases covered. Plan is knight d7 and then king e7 and so on. So in the game Malinin versus Trushelov, played in Leningrad in the year 2000, after bishop c7 h3, black played knight bd7, white played a4 because he could see b5 coming up, black played a6, knight came to d2, h6 kicked the bishop away, and now b5, and then bishop b6 completed a very satisfactory opening for black. Black is getting rid of his slightly worse bishop there. So okay, knight bd7 was played in Barayev as Myprashvili. White castled on the queen side, and now black played h6. Once again, I suppose a6 is a possibility, and if white plays a4, well, only then do we go h6. This was played in the game Momomba versus Toulouse, Elista, Olympiad 1998. Again, leading to an equal position. Okay, h6. Bishop h4 was played. Knight b6. Bishop comes to e2. And black brought his king up to e7. Bishop comes to g3, hitting the pawn on e5. Knight bd7. And now white brought his bishop back to c4. Knight came to b6. Bishop e2. And knight bd7. And just when it looks as though the game is actually going to be agreed drawn, because of course bishop c4 would invite a threefold repetition, Barayev decides to keep fighting with knight d2. Whether that's justified or not, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that actually white is that much better in this position, if he's better at all. At any rate, bishop b4 was, as Myprashvili's aggressive reply. And the point of that is that if white plays knight d5 in this position, black's going to take that and go f5. Suddenly, the position's transformed. Black has a 4-3 majority on the king side, white has a 4-3 majority on the queen side and in the centre. So it's all about who can actually transform his advantages into something concrete. Well, at any rate, after f3, king f6, c3, bishop d6, knight c4, b6, black certainly has some counterplay. He's anchored his centre. He can play bishop b7 and bring his rook to the middle. He can also think about pushing those kingside pawns up the board. There's plenty of play left. So going back to bishop b4, Barayev tried to unbalance the position with f4. Again, I'm not sure whether this was wise or not, because after bishop takes c3, b takes c3, black has the promising move here, knight to c5, attacking the pawn on e4. If you don't like knight c5, e takes f4 was also a possibility. I'm sure that's what a lot of players were thinking of playing in this position. Black's got to be a little bit careful in this position, after, for instance, moves like knight e8, e5, but by keeping the e6 square under full control, the e-pawn can be held under restraint, and after bishop e3, b6 again, black is okay. Black has a decent position here. But back at the game, as Myprashvili preferred knight c5. Bishop f3, protecting the pawn. E takes f4, bishop takes f4, and now bishop comes to e6. And that is an interesting move, because it's actually allowing white to take on c7. An opportunity Barayev took. Just going back to bishop f4, there was a legitimate way to defend c7 by going knight to e6. That was another possibility. But bishop e6 is actually quite an interesting move, because after bishop c7, rook a c8, black is getting significant counterplay against white's double c pawns. Okay, white's got an extra pawn in this position, but how easy is it to hold that pawn? For instance, after bishop g3, if we just go back, black has knight a4, and suddenly black has quite a bit of counterplay here. So after rook a c8, Barayev went bishop a5. Then came knight fd7. Again, we see the black knight training in on the dark squares. Very thematic play in the endgame. Knight b3, b6. Bishop comes to b4. And now king comes to f6. Rook hf1. And king comes to g6. So, it's a rather surprising pawn sacrifice by black. But black certainly has excellent compensation. We can see that white has 4 isolated pawns in this position. Black's got the 2 compact pawn islands. And black has a nice square on e5 for the knight. For instance, after bishop e2, already as Myprashvili was on the ball with knight e5. And, well, I don't know. Somehow this position is easier for black to play, despite the fact that he's a pawn down. For instance, if white plays knight d4, let's say white decides to centralise his knight, I think black can take on a2. And after king b2, just bishop c4. This is already looking better for black. Obviously the bishop would come to f3, but the bishop's just come from there. It's a less than impressive square for the bishop. Black has ongoing compensation. Or, as in the game, after knight e5, Barayev can take the knight on c5, and I play rook d6 and just argue here, well, I am a pawn up, but you know, you've yet to get your pawn back. I'm controlling the d file. But in spite of all this, I don't know, black has good defensive possibilities here. And if he ever gets the pawn back, he's going to immediately be better. Well, judge for yourselves from what happened, because let's go on with the game now. Black played rook c7 to cover his pawns. White played h3, and now black just brought the rook into the game on e8. Now white's got to be a little bit careful about his soft pawn on e4. Alright, rook went to d8. Black was not interested in exchanges yet, and rook came into d6. Bishop c4. Seeing that after bishop takes c4, black plays knight takes c4. forking both the rook on d6 and the pawn on e4. Perhaps white should play bishop d3 in this position, but instead, in the game, Barayev played the peculiar looking move bishop d1. And suddenly, after f5, black has threats. I'm sure Barayev missed this move. E takes f5 was his perhaps slightly surprised reply. Knight came to f7. This is possibly the option that Barayev missed, but of course now it's too late. Bishop comes to h5. Knight takes d8. Bishop g6 check. King h8 looks dangerous for an instant, but black's bishop drops back to g8. I don't know how far both players saw in this position. You know, it's difficult to say. Maybe Barayev thought to himself, well, I've got two pawns for the exchange in this position. Black is all tied up. It's not going to be easy for him to unravel. I would imagine this position might be better for me. However, I think this is a very optimistic and unrealistic assessment, as you'll see. And rook e5 is an excellent move, highlighting the fact that it's not white who's better in this position. In fact, it is black, and you'll see why in a moment. Rook f8 was played, trying to keep black tied up. g6, a really excellent move by Asmai-Prashvili, freeing up his king. White took, and out come the king. Rook comes to b8, and rook comes down to e3. Now black has definite ideas of rook g3, and then rook takes g2. Perhaps white should play knight d2 in this position, but in the game he came up with bishop h5. And now bishop d5 was another excellent reply. White's actually got three pawns here for the exchange, but his pieces are very passive, and that bishop on d5 is incredibly strong. White tried g4 to keep his pieces and pawns together, but now it was time to start regaining the material sacrificed earlier with rook takes h3. Barayev played rook e8. Well, he could try king b2 in this position, but then rook h2 has ideas of bishop e4. And if white tries to defend with knight d2, black shows another string to his bow with bishop takes f5. It just shows you how difficult it is to play these positions. You know, even a 2700 player has actually gone wrong in this endgame, or misjudged it, let's say. Now let's go back to the game. Rook takes h3. Black is now starting to put on the pressure. Rook e8 was played, an attempt to bring the rook back into the game. Another pawn went west with rook takes c3. So white's down to one pawn for the exchange. Knight d2 was played. Rook d7. Rook e5. And now rook h3. Yeah, the knight on d2 is completely dominated by black bishop. For instance, if white goes knight e4, I think black's just going to take that knight off and then go rook 2. And well, white is fully on the defensive here, and it's not so far away before black starts to get his other rook into the game. So I'm not sure, but even here you'd think that after king b2 white would have some defensive chances. But in the game, after rook h3, c4 was played, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Bishop takes c4. Excellent move. If knight takes c4, rook c3 check. Knight e4. White's desperate to get his pieces coordinated. Bishop f7, with the intention that if white plays knight takes c5, black pins that knight with rook c7. And if bishop takes f7, king takes f7, king d2, black has rook g3. And the white pieces are very tied up. The g4 pawn's going. What black needs is a passed pawn. And with rook g3, he's on the verge of creating that passed pawn on h6. So, back at bishop f7, white played f6, struggling for coordination. King went back to f8. Off came the bishops. White scarcely had no choice. And now g5, striving to prevent black from creating that passed pawn. Whoops, excuse me. Rook h5. Very good move, pinning the pawn against the rook. Rook takes c5. H takes g5. King c2. Rook h2 check. king c3, rook h3 check, and now black pins the knight after king c4. Rook e5 only move, and now another brilliant move by Asmai-Prashvili. Rook takes e4, rook takes e4, and now king takes f6. Trading down into a winning rook and pending. Why is this winning? Well, quite simply because the white king is cut off. Thus it's child's play really. Actually, first of all, improve the position of the rook, then safeguard the pawn on a5, and finally all is ready for the pawn's advance. King g6, king h5, and then g4 will win the game. So Barayev decided to resign. So a long protracted endgame once again, but black showed all the qualities needed of him in this variation: patience, determination, and good technique. Well played, Asmai-Prashvili. We moved now to the Slovenian Team Championship in 2008, and a game between Tony Kos, graded 2328, and Darko Supancic, who's graded 2376. And it's a kind of rerun of Barayev Asmai-Prashvili, but this time around white tries a slightly different plan. Firstly, the knight comes out to attack the e-pawn, bishop defends as normal, bishop comes to g5, knight bd7, castles, and now a6. Careful move, preparing b5 and stopping the white knight from getting to b5 itself. And now white comes out with what I consider to be a very plausible move, knight h4. And there's no doubt about it, the threat of knight f5 has to be respected. Well, Supancic played h6, and that in itself is a very careful move, after which white retreated with bishop e3. Of course, if white takes, black recaptures, with the knight. White brings his knight into f5. I think black can simply take that knight off and play king e7 with what looks like an equal position. And if you don't like king e7, well, b5 might also be a possibility. Rook d8 is a further possibility. Knight g4 is a fourth possibility. At any rate, this position looks about level. Going back to bishop e3, now black played g6, and after f3 he played king f8. What I liked about this game was black's patience in regrouping his position. He carefully cut the white knight out of f5. Now he improves the position of his king, and the final stage in achieving equality is to start regrouping. Rook comes to the centre, pawn goes up to g4, and now the knight comes back to f8. An excellent square from which the knight might come to e6, and then a whole complex of dark squares will be observed. Remember, black's overall intention in this position is to exchange off the dark square bishops if he can. Well, white decided to intercept that by putting his knight in on d5. There was a trade, and now black brought his knight back, and white played rook d3 and offered a draw. I looked at this position for a while, and I thought to myself, well, which was accepted by black, by the way, there's no reason why black should agree to a draw in this position. Again, it's one of those optical illusions. It looks as though white is actually slightly better in this position, but is that really the case after, say, knight c5? If rook d2, I think black plays bishop e7 stepping aside, and the point of that move is to prepare c6. Once black plays that move, all the squares on the d file are covered. That's what you've got to look for. White's got this open file, but he hasn't got any what we call entry squares. All the entry squares into black's position are covered, and this makes white's life, well, very difficult if he wants to claim any sort of advantage. So after bishop c4, bishop e6 would be a natural enough move, and the idea of that is that if white plays bishop c5, black can go bishop c4. There'd be a trade on e7. Now white is hoping perhaps to penetrate to either d6 or d8. I'm not too sure, about, for instance, the penetration to d6. What is that actually doing? And in fact, black can, in this position, even here, get some counterplay after f6. Rook comes in, and now rook h8, threatening h5, and if h4, h5. And you can see the way black is working out counterplay. I think black's bishop is slightly better than the knight in this position, and black has all bases covered. So this position would simply be unclear. If white plays g5 here, well, I think black could take that, and then once again black has a nice strong protected passed pawn there, and he could, for instance, get on the case with rook f8. So black is by no means worse, and I think a draw is a fair result. That would be all. That was a short game, a fairly thematic game, and you know, perhaps it's well worth looking over that game several times to see the ideas and the way they flow. Summarising, I think the end game after e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8, king takes d8 is acceptable for black. Let me just review the qualities needed to play this endgame with black. The foremost quality is patience. You can't do too much too soon. The second quality is an eye for counterplay. Occasionally black will get counterplay in this endgame, and you have to look out for it and be ready for it. Thirdly, watch out for play on the dark squares. Your dark square bishop is your worst piece. This is the piece you'd like to exchange off. You'd also like to leave white with a poor white bishop, white squared bishop, on f1. Finally, and I think this is most important, a degree of technique is required in these endgames. You'll have to brush up on your technique if you want to play this position regularly with black, but that shouldn't deter you at the outset. You're going to learn a lot about queenless middle games when you play this position on a regular basis, and that will improve your all-round chess education. So don't shy away from endgames of this type with black. Embrace them. They will improve your chess. Okay, now obviously a lot of white players are not going to be satisfied with some sort of endgame on the board after move 5. So they're going to look for other alternatives after e5 to sharpen the game up. Now, in place of knight f3, which actually I consider to be the best move, going back into a Philidor, there aren't that many alternatives for white which make a lot of sense, apart from f4 and knight ge2. For instance, the immediate bishop e3 is met comfortably by e takes d4, bishop takes e4, knight c6, and then the bishop simply in the wrong place. So, in the next game, we're going to take a look at f4. Obviously, this is a critical move. It's aggressive. It's what a lot of players would like to use if they could against the pert modern complexes. You routinely see the move f4. So why not here? Well, e5 is a very forcing move. I think black should take on d4, drawing the queen out, and then just simply play knight c6. And in virtually all games here, white has gone bishop b5. And the first game I'm going to show you is a game from the Vilnius Open in 2006 between Dambrauskas, graded 2361, and Zagorskis, who's graded 2489. And in this game, black played bishop e7, which might seem slightly surprising when a6 is available or bishop d7 is available, but black places a high priority in this position on getting castled. He knows the Achilles heel in white's position is the e4 pawn, but that will not become apparent unless black can race ahead in development and somehow take advantage of the weaknesses in white's position. With bishop e7, black is simply going to ask white to take on c6 without being provoked. It really is as simple as that. And whether white plays knight f3 now or bishop e3, black is going to castle, and then white will be faced with the problem of whether to take on c6 or not. Of course, if he retreats the queen, he loses time. Fair enough. Well, Dambrauskas went bishop e3, and sure enough, black castled, after which white took on c6. And this is what I believe most of your opponents will do. The move bishop b5 makes no sense without this capture. Okay, b takes c6, and Dambrauskas castled on the queen side. In the next game, we're going to see Grandmaster Julian Hodgson playing with the white pieces, castles short. Not, of course, in this position with the knight on g1, but and of course, this is a completely different approach. Bishop castles on the queen side is very aggressive, and black now has to handle this correctly. Alright, bishop b7. Now, the bishop on b7, the light square bishop, is the piece white hasn't got. So black is looking to bring that bishop into the game. As soon as he brings that bishop into the game, white's got to be careful. So there's no doubt about it, c5 is very high on the list of black's priorities, and targeting that pawn on e4 is a must. This is why after knight f3, Zagorskis plays rook e8. He's clearly intending c5 and then bishop f8, putting immediate pressure on the pawn. Dambrauskas went knight g5. Black went h6. And now white played the imaginative move h4, which would be all very well if black had to take that knight. But when black continues thematically with bishop f8, white now has the problem of what to do with his e-pawn. The move h4 also didn't come without drawbacks, and now there's a nice juicy outpost square for black knight on g4. So not all doom and gloom for black by any means. White took time out to try to protect his pawn should the need arise, and black continued to flexibly develop with queen to d7. Queen came back to d1, and now here we go, the thematic move c5. This is the move you should be trying to get in if you can. Bishop d2 looks rather passive, but how else was white going to defend that pawn? If he pushed it, he would lose it. So he moves the bishop out of the way in the hope that one day he's going to be able to play e5 successfully. But queen g4 was an excellent reply by Zagorskis and quite takes the wind out of white's sails. At some stage, when the queens are off certainly, white's got to remember that he's got a knight on g5 on pre. So this more or less obliges white to continue with forcing play, that's e5, and of course after queen takes d1, knight takes d1, now the bishop on b7 is starting to become very powerful indeed. And I think black is now getting on top. D takes e5, f takes e5, and now knight to g4. And suddenly white has serious problems. White probably thought he was playing good moves, but the fact is black's development is so quick and so pointed in this line that white has to be very, very accurate too. And in this game white didn't manage it. Perhaps the plan with knight g5 and h4 was a little bit ambitious, but well, now white has to reap what he's sown, because the knight is now on pre. He's got to go back, and black snapped it off. Thank you very much. A pawn down the drain and a beautiful knight on e5 to boot. And now of course black has two ideas. The first idea is simply knight takes f3, but the secondary idea, knight c4, is no less powerful. That is a really strong square for the knight. Rook e3, he probably couldn't see what else to do. Knight c4, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, and now white's getting rather desperate when he plays rook e1. White's saying, well, okay, your extra pawn is doubled, it's fixed on a dark square, it might not mean very much. That was a wrong appraisal of the position, and now rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, h5 was the excellent continuation. Essentially, black is looking to create a pass pawn on the king side. It's very convenient for black indeed that his king is over where the action is going to take place. So far from saving the game, white has just entered into a lost endgame, and not an especially difficult endgame for black at that. Firstly, black attacks the bishop, then he comes out with bishop e7. He's going to actually take a second pawn on h4. White tries to get his king into the action, but black is far too quick, and the knight comes in and attacks the pawn on f4. Pawn moves forward, h4. This is the way black's going to win the game. It seems very, very easy when you see it. Bishop h4, and that is that. The bishop cuts the knight out of the game, the pawn queens. So after a certain moment, a surprisingly easy win for black. And f4 maybe is not quite what it's cut out to be. My second game featuring f4 comes from a tournament in England played in year 2000. Playing white is Grandmaster Julian Hodgson. He's graded 2640, and playing black is the international master Adam Collinson. And this game followed the contours of the last one, with black bringing his bishop out to e7. This time white played knight f3. Black castled. Now white took on c6, as he probably should if he wants any sort of advantage whatsoever. Black takes back, and now we see a fundamental difference of approach by Hodgson. He castles short. What Hodgson's trying to do is to beat black positionally, it seems to me. He's not trying to blow black away with any sort of opposite sides castling position. He's just content to play positionally in the knowledge, or so he thinks, that the double pawns are going to become a liability. Well, okay, black played c5. I think in this case it's important for black to activate that light square bishop immediately. It's the same type of idea as last time, with black bringing his bishop to b7, trying to put pressure on e4 as quickly as he can. So probably black's plans include moves like rook e8 and bishop f8, and possibly even the break d5 in the centre. And certainly after Hodgson's move, b3, and he probably couldn't see a better square for the bishop. I mean, it could well be that bishop e3 is answered by moves such as knight g4. So the thing is that Hodgson was trying to find a good location for the bishop. So b3 simply intends bishop b2, and maybe rook a e1 completing development. But now Collinson struck out with the interesting move d5. And the first point of this move is that e5 is probably going to be answered by knight e4. And after knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes d8, rook f takes d8. Okay, black has a fractured pawn formation, but he has a very active position, and white did well to avoid this continuation because it's completely prospectless for him. So Hodgson decided to play for a better endgame by taking all the pieces off. Off came the pawn, off came the knights, off came the queen, and then bishop takes d5. So now we have an interesting unbalanced position where black's two bishops are hoping to outweigh the defects in his pawn structure. Well, Hodgson went bishop b2 and black went c4. It was obvious that this was going to be a good deal for black. So let's just drop back to bishop takes d5 and see if white can't play better by playing c4. Now if black plays sluggishly here, white will simply be able to gang up on the pawn at c5. I mean, the pawn is there waiting to be attacked. So black must waste no time and activate his position to the utmost. Therefore bishop takes f3 followed by bishop f6 is mandatory. The rook moves, in comes the bishop to d4, check, and now white has two blocks really which make any sense. If he goes king h1, we go rook fe8 with equality. If he goes king f1, f5 is a good move, and I think that also gives black equality. Letting the king out if and when necessary. Rook d3, rook takes e1, king takes, rook e8 check, king f1, and now rook e6. And by these means black maintains an equal game. Going back to c4, bishop takes f3, bishop takes, rook takes, bishop f6, and then in comes the bishop. If white plays bishop e3 in this position, rook fe8 is a simple move, and then if bishop takes d4, c takes d4, and this is an equal rook ending. So going back to bishop takes d5, and we're back at the game now. Perhaps it wasn't so easy for Hodgson, and so he decided to cut his losses and go bishop b2, letting black play c4, but he thinks, okay, well I'll play rook a d1. If he takes on b3 at any stage, I'll still have connected pawns on the queen side, and he'll have two pawns which are split. But I think after rook f d8, that black is equal now, because of this giant bishop on d5. So as the game goes, it would seem this is the correct assessment. Rook fe1 happened, bishop b4, black is holding white at bay with these lovely bishops, and perhaps even more than that now, as he shuts down the dark square. So bishop a1 was played by Hodgson. Now black played bishop e4. That was the point of this idea all along. Suddenly the bishop is actually putting an enormous amount of pressure on white's position. a3 was played, bishop takes a3, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c2, rook takes, b4, and now the excellent move c5, and it becomes clear around this stage that white is fighting for a draw. He can expect no more from the position. Black has the bishop pair, he's got an extra pawn which is now being actually realised, the advantage of the pawn, and white is really struggling to hold this game. Perhaps the only thing saving him here, or which he intends will save him, is the fact that his king can get into the game quicker than black's. But really I don't think this should save him in the long run. So that was why Collinson was very happy to swap the rooks off, and after bishop e5, Black maintained his extra pawn with bishop e2, bishop b8, bishop takes b5, bishop takes a7, and now another excellent move, f6. Now, Black is going to win this game basically by pushing his passed pawn up the board. He's got a little bit of work to do before he actually gets that pawn rolling. And the first important thing, of course, is to get his king in the game. That's why f6 is such a useful move. It makes room for the black king to wander up into the centre. A notable point of f6 as well is that it cuts a white knight out of e5 or g5. So white's got to find another location for his knight. Okay, f5, stopping the knight from coming to e4. King f2, king f7, bishop b8, and black's king continues his journey into the centre, where of course he's beautifully posted. Knight b1 hitting the bishop. Bishop c1, still scant chances of drawing this position for white really. Black's two bishops are still very active, and he's got a very strong passed pawn there. So it's just a question of how he gets that pawn home. And Collinder decides the way to do this is to get his king over to the queen side and then try and oust the knight from c3. So king up to c5. Seeing this plan, Hodgson moves to stop him or try to dissuade him. Bishop d2, not to be dissuaded. g5, and now the culmination of Black's scheme. King b4. Knight d5 check, and now king b3. And now of course Black's idea is very simple. The pawn is queening. So white goes for broke with knight f6, and in a sense this is a bluff move, which Collinson calls by playing c3. White's got to take that or the pawn queens. He takes on h7, bishop d2. Of course the two bishops are going to have their say here. Takes, h4, bishop h6, h5, bishop 4, and that was that. White resigned. Black brings his king back and will mop up what is left of white's position. So just summarising, going back to the opening now and summarising f4, perhaps it's not as dangerous as it looks. With e takes d4, queen takes d4, knight c6, followed by bishop e7 and rapid castling, Black secures satisfactory chances. My first game involving knight ge2. Well, actually it's not strictly my first game, because we saw that game in the introduction, that superb game by Juric. It's very topical. It comes from the Melody Amber tournament, played in March 2009, and playing white is none other than the world champion Vishy Anand. So you could say that if Anand plays knight ge2, it's going to be popular with a lot of your opponents as well. Playing black is Alexander Morozevich. Now, in case you don't know the Melody Amber tournament, it's a tournament of various disciplines. The players play over-the-board chess, they play rapid chess, they play blindfold chess. And this was the blindfold game between Anand and Morozevich. Now, lest you say, okay, why are you considering blindfold games in a theoretical DVD? Well, the fact is these players are so strong that, you know, they can actually play brilliant blindfold games as well. This was a very good game by Morozevich. Spoiled only at the end by a big blunder by Anand, as we'll see. But the opening is very theoretical and very appropriate to our discussion. Anyway, we saw what happened after f3 and bishop e3 in the Juric game. Black went knight bd7, c6 and b5. This time Anand goes g3. And Morozevich continues with c6 and then b5. So this is the way, obviously, he intends to get counterplay against Anand's setup, to try and worry white with the threat of b4 at some point. Both sides castle. White plays a3, and now black knight bd7, and now Anand plays h3. So these are prophylactic moves by white, trying to take away squares from the black pieces. And now Morozevich shows a good plan by playing rook b8 and then a5. So black is insistent that he will go through with b4, obtaining counterplay on the queen side. This is thematic and highly instructive. Anand tries to put paid to the advance of black's b pawn, and at the same time he takes the c4 square away from a black knight by playing b3, and black just plays rook e8. Now white plays g4, and this reveals Anand's plan. He intends a king-side pawn storm, backed up perhaps with knight g3, and this is why black gets on the case immediately with b4, ousting the white knight from the centre. And now another excellent move, d5. This, I would say, is the correct way to counter White's ambitions on the king side. Black is reacting in the centre quite correctly. D takes e5 happened. Knight takes e4 and pushed on with f4. To some this may appear very frightening, but Morozevich is completely fearless and played bishop a6 and then took the knight. D takes e4 and then put his knight on d4, threatening a crunching fork on c6. Black defends c6. It's curious that there's no way to take advantage of the unprotected black bishop on a6. Rook f2, of course, the rook was on pre. And now g6. Knight b2 happened. Rook a8. Knight e2. And then bishop h4. So, well, suddenly I think black is better. He's got two nice bishops. He's got open lines for his pieces. And the white knights are a little bit passive. It's difficult to see the white pawns coming on any further, although black's got to be careful, of course, that he doesn't get his bishop on h4 trapped with a move such as g5 by white, which I presume Anand prepares by going rook g2. But again, Morozevich isn't fazed by this. Quite consistently he plays knight b6, and that move intends knight d5, which will be a marvellous square for the knight, of course. So Anand tries to stop him, cut him out with c4, but black's having none of it. B takes c3. Knight takes c3, and now a move which completely freaks Anand out. Knight to d5. Now you have to imagine that these guys are blindfold. So, well, admittedly Anand is the world champion, but this is the first real point in the game where white should be getting worried, because black is getting serious play together with knight d5. Now in the game, Anand played a terrible blunder. Queen takes d5, triple question mark, and after c takes d5, he resigned. Okay, his mind was obviously tripped. You know, he saw the black counterplay, he didn't like it, and so he blundered. But what happens if knight takes d5, and then queen takes d5? Well, clearly that move Anand saw in his mind's eye was queen c3, and he was probably wondering how to meet this move, and then just forgot all about the fact that he hadn't taken on d5 with the knight yet. So took with his queen. That's the best explanation I can come up with. It really is difficult for white to defend this position. For instance, queen d4 is the only move to protect both pieces. Then black takes on b3, regaining his pawn. Now black's got this gigantic bishop on a6, potentially. He's got a roving queen. White hasn't anchored any of his pieces really, and his rooks are disjointed. If white goes g5, black continues to get his pieces together very nicely with rook d8 and then bishop c8, making sure that white can't play rook g4. If then rook a3, queen b8, king h2, bishop e6. Well, I'm sure Anand was juggling with such positions in his mind's eye, and he probably didn't like them. Certainly black has the advantage, but of course the game's not over. As it was, after queen takes d5, c takes d5, just to recap, the game was over, and white decided to resign. So just going back to the opening, knight g2, bishop e7, g3 can be met successfully by the flexible move c6 and then b5, getting counterplay on the queen side. This looks good for black. The next game I'll show you with knight ge2 comes from the Seville Open in 2008. Playing white is Ismail Karim, graded 2-350. Playing black, Master Paunovic, graded 2-522. So many grandmasters are seeing something in this line move order. There must be something to it. Okay, it's the same as Anand Morozevich, except this time white plays a4. He decides to put paid immediately to black's queenside expansionist ambitions. But this time black is able to play a5. And now, well, there was a slight drawback to a4. Black can perhaps look to station a knight on b4 in this position, which is what Paunovic quickly does to gain counterplay. So bishop g2, both sides castle, and black brings his knight out to a6. He's obviously eyeing the b4 square. And now a typical move in this system, h3. In this case it prepares bishop e3 without the need to worry about moves such as knight g4. It also prepares f4 in certain cases, again keeping a black knight out of g4 and also a black bishop too. But the knight settles in on b4. Bishop comes to e3, and now an extremely well calculated move by Paunovic, d5. He's trying to take direct advantage of this move, h3. There'll be tactical positions coming up when, if the bishop moves from g2, that immediately leaves the pawn hanging on h3. And the fact that the bishop can't move from g2 gives black the time he needs to organise his forces. So d5 is thematic and, well, thoroughly consistent with all of black's play so far. White takes on e5. Black takes on e4, and this would be the position, of course, where white would like to play bishop takes e4, but then of course comes bishop takes h3. So knight d4 was played. I think swapping the queens is problematic for white in this position because c2 is hanging, and there's no really comfortable way to protect that square. So knight d4 was played in the game. Black went queen d5, c3, knight a6, and now queen c2. And here Paunovic shows the depth of his calculation by playing knight c5, and after b4 the knight comes into d3. It still goes on because, well, white took on d3, bishop takes d5, c takes d5, and this is probably the end of Paunovic's calculation. It seems incredible that somebody could calculate 8 or 9 moves ahead in such a complicated position, but I assure you grandmasters can do this. And what is of course so impressive is that black is able to make a correct judgment about this position, because it seems for all the world as though the black pawns on d3 and d5 are very weak, but black has correctly judged that his bishop pair is of, you know, great importance in this position and far outweighs the poor pawn structure, and white also has 2 pawns on pre which are impossible to hold. So of course white tried to keep his queenside pawn majority together. Black gets to take on h3, and now white was obviously looking forward to regaining the pawn after rook fd1. But the bishop pair does mean something here, and after bishop d8 rook takes d3, black had rook e8, and black is putting some pressure on here. Now in the game white went bishop f4. I wondered when I first saw this position why white didn't play f4. I mean, I just thought that was so obvious, as it were. But it seems as though f6 is good for black. Black attacks the white centre before really white is well established. Whilst that rook is just sitting there on a1, white's centre will never be truly safe. And so f6 would undermine white's centre if king h2, bishop g4 doesn't change a thing. And if e6, well, bishop b6 is going to garner at least a pawn for black in this position. So that's why, going back to the game, white plays bishop f4. But now comes another slight surprise. I wonder whether white underestimated this move. g5, and now the very interesting move h6. Black is saying to white, well, you can't do very much. I can come and take your pawn whenever I like. Well, king h2 was played. Bishop g4, and now white went king to g2. If he plays f3 in this position and then f4, the answer is the same, f6. This move, cracking open the white pawn chain, is the key to black's chances of getting the initiative here. If white takes on f6, well, bishop takes f6 and black is incredibly active, threatening rook takes e3. If white goes e6, trying to bail out into some endgame after, for instance, knight takes e6, rook takes bishop d2, rook e2, check king h1, all as suggested by deep high arcs 12, and then king f7, rook takes d5. Well, then I think king e6 and then king f5 starts to look good for black. Admittedly, white does have a queenside pawn majority, but black certainly won't lose this position and could well hope to realise his extra pawn. For instance, after a5, h5, a6, b takes, rook c8, rook d5 check, and then king g4. By no means forced play, but it gives you a good indication of black's chances in this position. So, going back to the game, king g2 was played. Rook takes e5, knight f3. White's hoping to hold this endgame by normal means. Rook drops back, and now rook takes d5. Bishop e6, that's the piece white hasn't got. So black is using it rather than taking things with it. Rook d2, and black's bishop comes out to a5, and now bishop c3. So you can see the bishops are really ruling the roost here. Bishop comes back to g7. And now white has some problems with his queenside pawns. It's not possible to defend them in a legitimate sense. So white goes for counterplay correctly with rook c7. Rook takes a4, rook takes b7, and now bishop f5, setting up the game-winning threat of bishop e4. Rook a7 was played. Rook takes a7. Bishop takes a7, and now bishop e4. A move which provoked immediate resignation. Slightly surprising, you might ask. Well, perhaps it is, but really black's threat is g4. The only move to stop that threat is g4 by white, and then we have perhaps rook c8 as a simple move, threatening rook c3, and white is bound hand and foot. So rather than face that position, Karim decided to resign. So it seems that the system with knight ge2 and g3, whilst traditionally looking good, is actually met satisfactorily with c6. And as we've seen, after bishop g2, black can play b5. After a4, he can go a5. In both cases, with a perfectly good position. We come now to Philidor's defence itself, where white takes the opportunity to play for knight f3, which may well be his best move if the endgame after d takes e5 isn't working out. Well, after that, knight bd7 introduces the Philidor. Solid but passive would be the assessment most masters would append to this venerable opening, but there are some modern interpretations which dynamise the whole setup, and we're going to take a look at them right here, right now. Now, by far the most common fifth move for white is bishop c4. You know, that is played, I would estimate, in 8 out of 10 Philidor games. It's been demonstrated that this is the only move really to put pressure on black. Nevertheless, there are quite a few other fifth move alternatives, and I'm going to cover them here. By far the most dangerous of these moves is Shirov's idea, g4. This only came to the Philidor table very recently and caused consternation when Shirov first played it, because, you know, it just seems as though white is giving away a pawn for nothing. But his idea is that after knight takes g4, rook g1, knight gf6, bishop c4, he's gaining momentum and the initiative. He's threatening knight g5 immediately. He's got the open g file. He plans ideas such as bishop e3, queen to d2, queen e2, queen d2, or queen d3, followed by castles on the queen side. Then he'll take a look around and see what he can work up. Well, of course, in the hands of Shirov, such initiative can be deadly. Although I don't particularly like this pawn sacrifice. I think it's unsound, and I'm going to show you why in a few moments. Going back to the move knight bd7, there are other moves, obviously. Two of these are quite common in club chess. The first of these is the natural move bishop g5. That's just shunting the pieces out as far as I can see. It helps black in the sense that the bishop is a target for ideas such as h6, and maybe even as an object for exchange a little bit later on. Black will be quite happy in principle to exchange off a pair of minor pieces in this position, because he's got slightly less space, and that would help relieve the cramp. One way for black to play the position, well, I think the best way, is simply to go c6, bishop e7, and then castle. I think a4 by white was probably necessary, and if white doesn't play a4, then black should certainly take the opportunity to play b5 if he can. Well, white can continue with the polish shunting the pieces out, and now black has two plans in this position. He tried the normal modern dynamic plan of preparing b5 with moves like b6, a6, rook b8, and then b5. That's one idea. Or he may take on d4, although this can lead to a kind of liquidation after knight c5, e5. D takes e5, queen takes d8, rook takes, knight takes e5, and now the simple bishop e6. I mean, if you like a nice solid game with no problems, maybe this is the variation for you. And that bishop on g5 isn't really doing anything in positions of this type. It's just a target for the black pieces. So bishop g5, whilst natural, is unincisive. It doesn't put any pressure on black at all. Another idea is g3. I've had to face this myself against international master Klaus Berg in a master tournament some time ago. Again, black isn't troubled by this move at all. I think white would much rather have his knight on e2 in a position of this type. You see, the king's knight on e2 enables the bishop to protect the pawn on e4 when the bishop comes to g2, and also gives white the chance to play f4, which in turn gives his position some oomph. Without the advance f4, white has no pawn levers on the position, thus he can't put pressure on black, he can't open up the game. So black just plays normal moves here, and there eventually comes a position where black starts to put pressure on e4 with ideas such as e takes d4 and knight c5, and now black can think about b6, a6, rook b8 and b5 as well, which would be the standard plan. And once b5 comes, then b4 threat, and then there are threats to e4. So counterplay comes quite easily by these means. Some club players have asked me when they first encountered this position, what happens after d5? Why can't I just take space here and dominate the center? Well, this move would have a lot more going for it if white had a pawn on c4. In that case, white would have the pawn lever c5 to prepare, which would enable him to open up the game, and his centre would be a lot more solid. I think d5, the problem with d5 is you can't follow it up successfully. You've got no way to open up the game using that move. So, for instance, a good way for black to meet it, a simple way, is just g6. I mean, I think that's a very reasonable position for black suddenly. Bishop g7, castles, and then black can look to open up the game by playing f5. Another way to play is simply to play c6. Bishop e2, bishop e7, play the standard plan, and then, well, maybe you could go knight c5, hitting the pawn, knight d2, c takes d5, c takes d5, and once again black has a comfortable position. His pieces are on all good squares, and again he can look to prepare the move f5, followed by some sort of kingside pawn storm a little later on. There are other moves as well. Bishop e2 has been played without too much success. Once again black follows up by bishop e7, c6, and then starts to put pressure on e4 a little later on. Bishop d3 looks even more toothless from the white point of view. That's just a purely defensive move. I imagine black can just get on with his normal idea of c6. Also, when the bishop comes to d3, black can also consider like g6 in this position. In this type of structure, the bishop isn't that well placed on d3. So, to cut a long story short, if white wants any pressure on black in the Philidor, he's probably got to play bishop c4, or try to blow black away with this shear-off move g4, which, as I hope to show, just isn't sound. And I'm going to use the game Bromberger versus Gara, Budapest 2008, to try to illustrate why I think it's not sound. Firstly, black has to take that pawn. I mean, various ways have been looked at of declining this gambit, but why not take it if you can? You know, let white do his thing. And well, yes, the threat of knight g5 is dangerous, so I'm going to stop that by h6. And now I'm not sure how white actually demonstrates that black has any weaknesses in this position. You know, okay, he can get on with the process of castling on the queen side, but shouldn't black be able to cope with that? Well, let's just see. In the game Bromberger versus Gara, white played the most natural move here, bishop e3. That's been played loads of times. Going back, if white decides to open up straight away and delay the development of his bishop on c1, then I think black must prepare b5 as quickly as possible with c6. c6 is a key move in this position. It gives the black position momentum with the idea of b5. And I'm not sure. White doesn't want to play a4 in this position, does he? Because then he can't really find a safe haven for his king. And if he insists, I mean, the most obvious move is bishop e3. But if he insists on originality with a move like bishop b3, then we go b5, stopping queen c4. If white tries originality with a4, then queen a5 comes, bishop d2, queen a6. And if knight d1, black has g5, staking out space. If knight e3, b takes a4, bishop c4, queen b6, knight f5, and now queen takes b2. This was analysis I prepared for this DVD. with the help of deep hierarchs. Some of the moves look odd, but hierarchs assesses this position as much better for black. It's hard to disagree. By far the most common move, going back to h6, is bishop e3. And then black should get on with the process of preparing b5 with c6. Bromberger took on e5, and now it's a question of where white wants to put his queen. He can put it on d3 or e2. Well, Bromberger played into d3. Going back, queen e2 has been played. I think a good recipe for black against that is to play b5 and then bring his queen out to a5, with the idea of putting the bishop on a6 as quickly as possible. White played queen d2, b4, knight e2, rook 8, carefully protecting the knight. If queen e1, then c5. This is the way black starts to get excellent counterplay in this system. So queen d3 was played, going back to d takes e5. Black played b5 anyway. Bishop comes to b3, out came the queen. Castle's on the queen side. Bishop comes to a6. Knight went to e2, and now an excellent move here, pawn up to c5. And you can see it's hard for white to make inroads on black's position. He just hasn't got anything to purchase on. There are no weaknesses. Black's the one creating threats, and black remains a pawn up. It's noticeable that the open g file is of no relevance whatsoever in this position. Right, well, white has two moves here. In the game, Bromberger played c4. I mean, that's a move white definitely would have liked to have avoided, because it's pushing up a pawn in front of his king. If he goes bishop d2, kind of making room for the queen, black goes b4 anyway, and once again, this is a slightly awkward position for white to play. It's noticeable this pawn on e4 is a little bit loose. c4 maybe. Then I think black can castle on the queen side. And if knight g3, bishop b7, ge1, queen c7, queen f1, king b8, queen h3, and now just g6. The knights are denied entry points, and black just looks like he's a pawn up for nothing to me. So going back to c5, Bromberger tried c4. As I say, not especially comfortable with that move, I dare say. White brought his knight to g3, hoping to play knight f5 one day, and black moved to intercept that with the excellent bishop b7. Well, queen f1 was played. g6, queen h3, and now bishop c6. You see, the problem for white is black's position is not entirely passive. You know, okay, black is playing a series of defensive moves to start off with, but black has the plan of actually pushing this a pawn all the way up the board and continuing the assault against white's king. It remains to just move his queen back to c7, and now the a pawn is ready to roll. Meanwhile, white is struggling to find weak spots in the black camp. He's trying random moves such as knight g5, but if they don't threaten sacrifices on f7 or e6, I'm not at all sure what that knight's doing on g5. In fact, as the game goes, it proves to be in a fatally poor position. We'll see what I mean. Black played a5, white went rook e1, a4, white's going backwards, bishop e7, the knight is starting to feel ever so slightly insecure on g5. White played king b1, knight b6 was played. Now black's the one creating the threats. He's threatening knight takes c4, so white has to play another defensive move. He definitely does not want to play that move. Bishop d7, queen h4, and now I think a move that white missed, an excellent move by black, knight g8. And no matter how white wriggles in this position, he can't escape this deadly pin. And after f4, bishop f6, amazingly, that was that. There's no way out of the pin. Black is threatening to take, and bishop f6 protected that rook on h8. So that was that. And what was noticeable, white failed to find a weak spot in black's camp the whole game through. So my assessment of this gambit after g4, let's just go back. Dangerous, but black should certainly take it. You're going to have to be patient to start off with, but well, in the game I just showed, a player graded 2500 was in the end completely trounced. He failed to find any weak spot in black's camp and just taking a part in the tactics. So there you go. Shirov's gambit, probably unsound. We come now to white's best fifth move, which is without a doubt bishop c4. Bishop's aggressive on c4, eyes f7, and allows all the rest of the white pieces to deploy comfortably behind him. What should black do against this? Well, black must not falter, and the typical Philidor move is bishop e7. Okay, now, by far the most common move, and the move which introduces the main line, is castles. But we've got to take a look at white's sixth move alternatives now, and see how they work, hopefully in black's favour. Now the first of these moves is the caveman-like bishop takes f7. White's idea is that after knight takes f7, king takes f7, he has to strike knight g5 check and then knight e6. Now if this appears on your board for the first time in club chess and you don't know what to do, it might seem very scary indeed. It looks as though black has to move his queen to e8 and then white comes in and gobbles the exchange free of charge. Well, it's absolutely not free of charge, and I'm going to show you a remarkable game now, Walpert versus Heidenfeld from South Africa in the 1950s, where black completely turned the tables. And he starts the ball rolling with the excellent move Queen g6. Now Grandmaster Christian Bauer has suggested that white's best move in this position could well be castles and just play on a piece down, 2 pawns for the piece, some initiative. I don't believe that for a second. I think black should be able to defend himself after rook b8. I don't see any way for white to create concrete threats in the immediate future, and black can just continue with ideas such as h6 and king h7, after which he gradually exploits the advantage of the extra piece. Now I think if white goes in for this variation, and there might be some madmen who actually do that, then probably knight takes a8 will follow. But now queen takes e2 introduces a most dangerous counter-attack from black's point of view. This is one line, I think, which has to be learned. A lot of positions in chess can be played on feel. This line, because of the number of tactical moves and ideas happening on the board, simply has to be learned. And the sequence that black employs in this game is simply devastating. He takes on d4, drawing the white queen out into the open. Now white may have a threat of queen c4 check, but black can stop that with interest after knight e5. That not only defends against the threat, it threatens knight f3 check, winning the white queen. So white's got to proceed along force lines as well with f4. And now the brilliant move, knight fg4. Piece of inspiration from Heidenfeld. Again introducing a devastating tactical threat, bishop h4 check, which will win the game outright if black was allowed to play it in this given position. So white continued with tactics of his own, driving the black knight passive. And his idea now is that he can play queen c4, not only protecting the rook on f1, but attacking the black bishop on c8. However, black had it all covered and played a beautiful sequence. Bishop h4 check, and now the superb move bishop e6. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that Heidenfeld prepared this move all along, and well, it's just brilliant. If queen takes e6, queen takes f1. If queen e2, as was played in the game, retaining contact with the on f1, that comes into f2, check. Rook takes, bishop takes, f5, trying to decoy the bishop to a bad square, but black is having none of it. Queen g1 check, king d2, and now the inspirational move, knight e5. Brilliant idea, bringing the knight and the bishop into the game, and really this is game over. Okay, well, white tried knight d1. Bishop e1 check. What a move to finish. Queen e1, queen d4 check, king e2. And now the unusual, but nevertheless very beautiful move, bishop c4, checkmate. So, white can start the rough treatment if he wants to with bishop takes f7 check. But really, with this move, he ends up getting more than he bargained for. Now, if we just drop back to bishop e7, a better way to introduce this sequence starts with knight g5. You know, obviously the idea of bishop takes f7 check and blowing black away has a lot of appeal. So white players have tried to refine this idea. And the point of knight g5 is that when black castles, as he should, white is going in with bishop takes f7 check, and it's the same type of thing coming up, where the knight moves in and forks black on c7. But of course this time, the black queen is not allowed to come out to the active square on g6. So black's got to go queen d8, and now white takes on a8. And white's hoping that he's going to emerge from the complications with the much better position. Okay, now I'm going to show you a game, Muret versus Seret, which was played in France in 2008. Grandmaster versus International Master. And in that game, black played the excellent move b5. And the point of this, of course, is just to round up the knight with bishop b7. And if knight takes b5, then we have queen a5 check, stirring up a lot of trouble. So in the game, Muret played d takes e5. Muret is a very original grandmaster. He loves angling these unusual positions with it, you know, a lot of imbalance. This is the way he likes to play chess. But here, he may well be biting off more than he can chew. Seret is an excellent tactician himself. Bishop f4 happened. Black played knight c4. Eventually, black's going to be able to play bishop b7 and round up that knight. That is the aim. White castled. Black played bishop b7. White went b3. The black knight continued a jaunt into the white queen side. White played bishop c1. b4. Bishop takes a3. B takes a3. Queen d4. Queen takes a8. Hooray. And now it's time to summarise the results of the opening skirmishes. Okay, white has got rook and two solid pawns for the bishop pair. But black's bishop pair, well, in this type of position, you know, the bishop pair has to be respected. There are open diagonals all over the board. White is especially weak on the dark squares. There are some vulnerabilities on the long diagonal there, which black might try to exploit. Furthermore, black has, if I can just get rid of this arrow, it's a rather long one. Let's see if we can get it out. There are immediate weaknesses on e4. Yes, Muret in the game played f3. That's quite normal to try and shut down the knight on f6 and the bishop on b7. But then even more dark square weaknesses appear in white's position. And black moved to take advantage of that with knight d7. My actual assessment of this position is better for black, without any doubt. Difficult to play perhaps, but black's dark square control does mean a great deal in position of this type. Now, it's easy to get this position wrong. I have no doubt at all that Muret thought after knight d5, and with all the pieces coming off, that this endgame might be good for him. He's got connected pawns on the queen side, two extra pawns. He's got the open e-file highway to work with. You know, he probably thought, okay, I'm better here. But that's not at all clear. The pawn on a3, funnily enough, could become a real thorn in white's side the longer the game goes on. And white really doesn't want to be thinking about defending his pawn the whole game through with one of the rooks. You know, the rooks are aggressive pieces. They need to be used aggressively. They don't want to be tied down to defence. So white's got some problems on the queen side here. And as we'll see, these problems became very serious as the game progressed, with black gradually moving his pieces into more and more aggressive squares. As we can see, black is now threatening moves like knight a6 to b4. White went rook e3. He's trying to find some way of organising his queen side so that the weaknesses suddenly disappear. Black brought his knight to d7, attacking the pawn on c3. White went rook up to d3. Black brought his bishop to g5. Rook e8 check, king f7, rook a8. And now after knight e5, rook d1, rook takes c3, it was quickly becoming apparent that Muret hadn't really solved his problems by these means. His difficulty is that he wants to play rook takes a5, but then bishop e3 check, king f1, and now rook c2 starts to look very strong for black. There's even bishop c5 if black wants to temporise and maybe protect his pawn before going rook c2. At any rate, white might be in trouble in these variations. The black pieces are crawling all over his king. So Muret, seeing that variation coming up and going back now to the game, tried the tactical move f4. He was hoping to buy black off after bishop takes f4, rook f1, rook c1, and now rook takes a5. But king e7 revealed the true nature of things, as after rook takes c1, bishop takes c1, white still has problems with this blinking A pawn. You know, black is threatening to move him for the kill. White moved his king across with some knight idea like knight d3 to b4. So white has to take time out to prevent knight b4. Bishop b2, again renewing the threat to the A pawn of knight c1. And how is Murray to defend against knight c1? It's a very easy endgame to get wrong at the outset. You know, you might think all the way through that white's better, but then you come to a position like this and you realise that actually it's black who's better. It's white who's actually struggling. And as the game suggests, might even be lost in this position, because Murray can't find any answer at all to black's idea of coming in and taking off the A pawn. Gradually, Sure makes progress with his king as well. Knight c1 check, king c2, up comes the black king. The white rook is looking very lonely now, so he tries to buy some activity on the back. Up comes the king. Remarkable that only black seems to be making progress in this endgame. White goes for broke with b5. Knight a2, b6. Knight b4 check. King d2. And Murray decided to resign rather than see the coronation of black's pawn after a2. There is, however, a cute variation after a2, which I must show you, although I can understand why Murray wouldn't want to have seen it at the board. If white goes b7, bishop c3 check, king e2, black now takes a queen. And if rook c8 check, king d4, and white takes a queen, black has the nice mating variation with queen e1 check, king f3, queen e4 check, king g3, bishop e1 check, king h3, and now queen h4 checkmate. So, just going back to bishop e7 and revising that line once again, yes, this is a better way for white to play this sacrifice on f7, but I think after b5, intending bishop b7, black is in good shape. That sure was an entertaining game. Right, which brings us back one more time to the position after bishop e7, and to a game Frisk versus Simacek, which was played in the Olomouc Open in August 2008. Simacek, of course, is a 24-70 player, very strong. And this time white tried to refine the whole idea by playing d takes e5. And once again, if black plays d takes e5, white's probably intending to go for it with bishop takes f7 check and then knight g5 check, etc, etc. This time the white queen can enter the fray, maybe via e2, queen up to c4. This has proved dangerous to black. So I am proposing, going back to d takes e5, that black meet this move with the careful knight takes e5. Yes, I know that after knight takes e5, d takes e5, white can take an ending after queen takes d8, but I don't believe that to be dangerous for black at all. In the game Frisk versus Simacek, white decided to castle. Let's just take a brief look at queen takes d8, bishop takes d8, just a sec, I've gone too far, bishop takes d8, yeah. Well, now in endgames of this type, we know from our initial investigation at the start of this DVD that black should be looking to exchange off the dark square of bishops. So one plausible sequence could be bishop e3, c6, excellent move, preparing counterplay with b5, and after a4, knight g4, bishop c5, bishop b6, bishop takes b6, a takes b6, king e2, king e7, which just looks dead level to me. And I think that's the way black should handle this position. The databases all show black is scoring reasonably after the queen exchange. So maybe that's why Frisk kept the queens on after castles. Black continues to offer the trade with c6, white's not interested, queen e2, and now black struck out with typical Philidor efficiency, b5. Okay, bishop came back to d3, so white really just wants a game of chess here. I mean, I'm not sure that's the most incisive way to play, but white is just saying, okay, I'm going to try and play for a win by keeping the pieces on. The rest of this game is an excellent illustration of how black should play Philidor positions, in my view. And that's why I'm showing it to you now. First, he brings his bishop to a good square. White plays a4. Black plays a6. There are some exchanges on b5 and a8. And now, white plays bishop g5. But after castles, I assess this position as minutely better for black. Why? Because I think his bishops are better than white's bishops. I think that bishop on d3 is unimpressive. I think the knight on c3 isn't that great either. Black's got the A file. You know, black has also got defensive possibilities based on the exchange of dark squared bishops, and this he puts into practice, puts into effect by bringing his queen to d8 and then his knight to d7. And as we know, in these positions the exchange of dark squared bishops does tend to favour. Right, now with all his bad pieces exchanged off, it's a question of how black takes control of the position, and Simacek takes the open file. That's the first stage. The next stage is to manoeuvre the pieces into better positions. So up comes the black queen into a more influential post. White plays rook d1, and black not only gives his king a bit of air by playing g6, he cuts a white knight out of f5. So two useful things with one move. h3, king g7, the king comes closer to the centre of the board. Queen d2, and now knight to b6. So black is in full control of the position, and please note the recurring Philidor theme of the bad white bishop vis-a-vis the central pawn. Rook c1. It's pretty clear that white doesn't really know what to do, so he's trying to defend his position just by normal means, not weakening the position in any way, just playing neutral moves, asking black, well, how are you going to make progress? The answer comes in knight a4, queen b6, and then c5. Black is pushing forward, opening up lines against the white queen side. White continues to play primarily defensive moves. Black plays rook c8, threatening a capture on b4, and white gets out of the way. Now, the first penetration. C takes b4, and knight c3. And suddenly white starts to feel the heat. That's come in, very nasty fork, three ways, and well, I think white is probably suddenly losing this position. He tried rook f1, knight captures on e4. Of course the white player is only graded 2100, so I think really the rest of the game is an excellent demonstrated technique by black, showing exactly why he's 300 points higher. Once he gets a winning position, there's no relaxation. He moves in for the kill with a nice tactical shot. Knight takes f2. Rook takes, queen takes e3. Rook f3 was played. Rook comes down to c1 check. King h2. And now centralisation wherever possible. Black has a nice passed pawn there. It's just a question of finding the best way to get that pawn going. Okay, queen a5. Queen g1 check. King g3, queen e1 check. Rook f2, only move. Rook c3. Now white's all tied up. The rook and the bishop both pinned. Queen e3, threatening queen f4, checkmate. Rook b2, giving the king a bit of air. But rook takes f3 concludes matters. And in this position white decided to resign, because after g takes f3, queen d4 check picks off the rook. So, going back one more time to the position after bishop e7. There are quite a few 6-move alternatives for white, but as we've seen, all of them are probably inferior to castles. So we're going to move on to that next. The most common way to play the main line of the Philidor for white starts with the moves bishop c4, bishop e7, castles, and now rook e1. An all-round good move, and white avoids to a certain extent misplacing the queen early on, as well as the queen's bishop. Rook e1 can always be useful, whereas you don't quite know yet where you want the white queen or the bishop on c1. Well, black should respond with c6, and now white usually plays a4, denying black the opportunity to play b5, and so battle is joined. And the first game I'm going to show you comes from the Moscow Open. It's a game between two lady players, Kovanova playing white 2-3-4-8, and Ambar Kumova 2-2-2-8 playing black. And this game was played in February 2008. And in this game, black employs what I consider to be a very crafty move order with the immediate rook b8. Black's plan in this position is basically A, to avoid committing the bishop on c8 early, and B, to play b6, a6 and b5. And I think this move order by black actually cuts out a lot of white attacking tries based on the move d5, because after d5 black can simply play c5 and block the position, and then hopefully go on to some sort of kingside pawn storm later on. So in the game Kovanova versus Ambar-Kumova, white tried b3. Basically more out of not really knowing what to do than anything else, I think. But it's a bit weird, this position. If white plays bishop e3, which looks like the most natural move, knight g4 is slightly inconvenient. For instance, after bishop d2, I'm not sure that white would want black to nab that bishop. Black takes on d4, plays knight e5, bishop drops back, and now bishop h4 probes the white kingside and forces weaknesses. So it's a bit peculiar, you know. Bishop g5 isn't that effective either. So what has white got left? Kovanova played b3. Now black got on with the case, preparing her plan of b5 with b6 and a6. White played bishop d3, stepping aside, and now b5 was played. A takes b5, A takes b5. Now this is by no means the greatest game in the world, I do understand that, but I think it's very important to show the type of game you yourself are going to encounter when you play this line of the Philidor. Not everybody's going to be up to speed with the latest theory. They're not going to play perhaps the best moves all the time. Instead, they're going to play decent moves, something along the lines of what Kovanova is playing here, but not particularly incisive moves. You know, basically white is manoeuvring here, hoping that something will turn up. But there's no reason why it should. The black position is rock solid, and well, of course, white is threatening knight 5 in such a position, but black can easily deal with that with the regrouping move, queen d2, and then bishop f8. And black is basically in fine shape here. It's a level position with all to play for. b5, of course, and d6, the pawns, give black nice control on the queen side and in the centre. So white came in with knight f5. Who could blame her for that? And now black did not want the idea, like the idea of white's queen appearing on g5, so she played h6. White played h3, probably thinking about g4, and seeing g4 coming up, black reacted quite correctly in the centre with c5. And now we see that perhaps the white bishop on c4 is misplaced, because after d5 by white, I'm pretty sure black was thinking about going c4, gaining space and time. Black's ongoing plan, possibly king h7 and then g6, ejecting the knight. Later, black can look for opportunities to play f5. So going back, white played c3, and now black played a very interesting move here, d5, going over to a full attempt to take the initiative. Well, of course, if knight g3 in this position, then e takes d4, c takes d4, c4 starts to look very promising for black, who is opening up opportunities for all of her pieces. In the game, white played d takes e5, but black responded with d takes e4. And this is a very slightly confusing position, but the basic point is that black is doing absolutely fine after bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, rook takes e4, and now black has a choice. Perhaps the most promising move here is simply knight takes e5, when the knight on f5 hangs. But going back, bishop b7 is also promising, with the idea of knight takes e5 next. Now, let's go back to the game. D takes e4. White played c4, but I wonder whether she overlooked knight takes e5. The idea was that after bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, knight takes e5, black was able to play bishop takes f5. And suddenly, and regrettably from white's point of view, there are two pieces attacked. So what happened? White tried queen f4 to bail out. Black went bishop h7, and now white saw that the problem was that if you retreated the bishop to, well, anywhere really, f2, f1 let's say, black has bishop d6, and this is completely lost for white, unfortunately. So Kovanova went bishop takes e4. Black was happy to take that. Rook takes e4 happened, and now bishop d6 once again emphasised black's tactical superiority. White tried queen takes f7, but after queen takes f7, knight takes king takes, black established a winning position, and in fact Kovanova resigned. So a good game by black, in control of the tactics all the way, opened up the game at the right moment, and a game which showed the effectiveness and easy to understand nature of the a6, b6, rook b8 and b5 plan. My second game involving this rook b8 idea comes from the Russian Team Championship in Sochi, played in 2007. We quickly see the contours of the main line appearing on the board. White plays rook e1, and now our little refinement, rook to b8, which actually doesn't even appear in Christian Bowen's encyclopedic work on the Philidor, published by Everyman, the Philidor Files. So that of course makes it even more interesting why it shouldn't appear there, because it's obviously a decent move. Basically black is planning b6, a6 and then b5, and his rook is in the right place at that moment. We dealt with bishop e3 and b3 in the last game. Now let's take another look at a couple of other alternatives. What happens if white plays a5 here? Then I think black goes straight through with b5, and despite the fact that white can take on b6 in this position and get an open a file, that file isn't of enormous use to him, and black is preparing immediate counterplay with b5 and then b4. So d5 would be an attempt to try and puncture holes in black's position, but then comes b5, and if bishop f1 we go b4. If then knight b1 we go bishop b7. Black's position is coming to life, whereas white seems to be running on the spot, and after knight c5 it's obvious black has an excellent position. Going back to the position after d5 and then b5, if d takes c6 in this position, obviously b takes c4. White takes on d7, and now black has bishop takes d7, again with a very comfortable game. So after rook b8, I'm not sure what white should do. We've seen b3, we've seen bishop e3, we have seen a5. Now in Bazarov versus Yatsenko, white plays a fourth move, h3. Solid enough, non-committal, useful in some respects, strengthens the king side, doesn't commit to anything. So a decent move. Anyway, black just gets on with the job. b6 and then 6. Now preparing b5. And white dropped away with bishop f1. So prophylaxis all the way by white. He's just refusing to commit himself really. He's waiting to see what transpires. He is more or less anticipating the move b5 by playing bishop f1. Interestingly, black played bishop b7. He could go b5 straight away. I don't see anything wrong with it. White could probably take it and fix the pawns on the queen side. Then comes bishop b7, and if knight h4 now, which is the traditional reply to bishop b7, the black position comes to life with e takes d4 and then c5, after which black has a pretty good game. So I don't know, b5 was possible too, but anyway, bishop b7 was answered by queen to c1. I presume after knight h4 black was going to take on d4 in the same manner as the last variation and go c5, and if queen d1, h6 again, putting the question to the bishop. Slightly embarrassing given the unprotected nature of the knight on h4 once that bishop is jabbed away from g5. So white prepared everything by going queen c1, and black played rook e8. White took on e5 and went knight h4. So this is thematic play, and knight f5 is obviously an idea which black has to contend with. Okay, h6, hitting the bishop. Slightly embarrassing for white once again because of the uneasy relationship between the bishop on g5 and the knight on h4. So white decided to take and rid himself of the need to think about the unprotected knight, because of course now he can put the knight in on f5. But once he's taken on e5 and unleashed the bishop on e7, there's no need for black to play bishop f8. All that is satisfactory. And Yatsenko played his bishop out to the nice active square c5. Now black is very much looking to operate on the dark squares because, well, black has a dark square bishop and white hasn't. It really is as simple as that. And b5 is coming. b5 and then b4 with plenty of counterplay. White played bishop d3. Knight h5. Another manoeuvre you commonly see in the Philidor when the dark square bishops have left the board. Black is very much eyeing up the square f4 in this position for the knight. which is very close to the white king. It's an imposing position for the black knight, and queen g5 would surely follow. So white rushed over to the defence with knight e2, and black went queen g5 anyway, offering the exchange of queens. Now a different type of game arises. It's a more technical game, but black holds the upper hand here because he's got two nice bishops, and in particular that dark squared bishop has the potential of a giant in this particular position. White cannot contest it. He played g3. Black played g6, ridding himself of the knight on f5. Knight dropped back. Of course, it's tempting to take that knight and double white's pawns, but black decided that knight f6 was even better. Why surrender a bishop which is so powerful for not an especially good knight? Knight came to c1, bishop c8 attacking h3, king g2 protecting h3, and now the long awaited counterplay move on the queen side, b5. So very satisfactory position for black, who is holding most of the trump cards in this position. Trouble with white is white's structure, white's position is he can't do very much. He can manoeuvre and try to not make things worse, but that's about it. Okay, white continues his manoeuvring around the board. He's waiting for black to improve his position. And here's another typical idea, knight d7, with the idea perhaps of stationing that knight on c5, which intimidates the bishop on d3. Knight comes to f3, hoping that f6 will be a weakening move. c3 giving the bishop some space. Up comes the knight to attack the bishop, and bishop drops back, whereupon black plays bishop e6. So all very easy to understand moves. The black position is very active. He has plenty of play for all his pieces, and he's got pressure on the light squares as well as the dark squares. White has no real compensation for the loss of the two bishops in this position. So white is solidly worse here. He tries to push black backwards with b4. Black is happy to retreat. White takes the open file, and black challenges him on the a file. No entry square for white on the d file, they're all covered. h4, and now g4, pushing on, denying the white knight's space. And finally, black thinks it's time to surrender that bishop. Bishop takes e3. Well, of course he didn't do that without a reason. Obviously black could have done this a few moves ago. Now I think it's in slightly better circumstances. He's got white cramped on the king side there. That pawn on g4 is really cramping white's style there. And, well, nothing has changed. Black is still quite a bit better. And c5 was the excellent continuation. Gaining space and time after bishop b3, c4, and then bishop c2. After which black continued his policy of micro-improvements, move by move, with rook ed8. Alright, white must continue to run on the spot and not make things worse. Meanwhile, black improves his position, move by move. King f2, rook takes d1, rook takes a8, and now rook c1. So black has obviously calculated this is very awkward for the white bishop. In fact, he can't move anywhere, he's got to play rook a2 to protect. And now black continues his initiative, training his sights on the weak white pawns. White plays knight d2, and now bishop c8 with two ideas. One to play bishop b7, hitting e4, two to play king e6 if necessary. Probably both of those moves will be involved in the upcoming play. I mean, white can just do nothing. So black improves his position move by move. It really is methodical and excellent to watch. Now rook b2. It's peculiar. White's in a kind of zugzwang here. He's jammed up his position so much he can't do anything, so he's got to march up and down on the spot. Rook a1, embarrassingly cutting off the white rook from the a file. King g2, and now f5. It had to come, and the instant it does come, white finds himself compromised. King f2 happened. King f6, king g2, and now rook c1 again. Rook a2. Finally, black decides to take the pawn. He does it for a reason. He wants that c3 pawn in the rook and pawn ending. Rook comes to a5 with counterplay. Rook c2, a little refinement, driving the white king backwards. Well played, black. Rook takes c3, opening up fire against e3. Of course, this is lost for white. King must go back, There's a little bit of toing and froing, and then it's on with the show with c3. Now what is white to play in this position? In the game he went king e2. Obviously if he goes rook takes b5, we go simply c2, rook c5, and the standard idea, rook h1, so that if rook takes c2, rook h2 skewers king and rook. But king e2 wasn't that much better either. Rook b1, and white decided to resign because well, there are threats of c2 immediately and rook takes b4 otherwise. I mean, I don't think white can even play rook a2 in this position because of rook b2 check. So Bazarov resigned. Another successful outing for rook b8, which seems like a pretty good move. Our next game comes from the Turin Olympiad in 2006 between Gadir Guzainov, 2615, and Pavel Elyanov, 2665, who is an ardent fan of the lion. Okay, it quickly turns into a Philidor main line, and white plays the fashionable and most common move here, rook to e1, basically avoiding any immediate confrontation, making an all-round useful move and committing to nothing. Alright, black plays c6, white plays a4. And now it's a question of how you view this position. Black's standard plan here is to go b6, a6, rook b8, and then b5 to get counterplay. And it's just a question of the best way to do it. In this game, Elyanov plays b6 immediately. I personally recommend rook b8 as a better move order. I think b6 can possibly be taken advantage of with the immediate d5. And if c5, then a5 is a very interesting move. This I think to be very promising for white. Certainly if you play the b6 move order, after d5 you would have to investigate c takes d5, as recommended by Christian Bauer. To me this looks slightly better for white after knight takes d5, but rook b8 of course skirts around that problem and avoids premature commitment with b6. Now in the game Guzainov-Elyanov, actually Guzainov plays a slightly non-committal move here, bishop a2, refusing to take black head on with the move d5. So we quickly go back into a scenario where black gets the chance to actually carry out his main plan. So white plays a3, black plays rook b8, and it's very important in this position that black doesn't play bishop b7. There are reasons for that. For instance, in a previous Guzainov game against Nguyen Ngoc Truongson, 2555, Vietnamese master, black played the bad move bishop b7, then came knight h4. This is one good reason why the bishop should stay on c8 and not go to b7, because the threat of knight f5 is actually quite dangerous. Black took on d4 and played c5, hoping to liberate the bishop. Queen went back and black played g6, but then came bishop h6, rook e8, knight f3, and the problem is that black has weakened himself. He's been forced to weaken himself on the king side with g6. Bishop f8 was an unwelcome move to have to play. White took the bishop, then played knight g5. It's around here that the weaknesses really do start to mean something, because f7 is on free. Black is forced into yet another uncomfortable move, and a further uncomfortable move after queen f3, and now after rook a d1, white had achieved more or less his dream position in this line. This is what you want to avoid, and it has to be said, the bishop on b7 is ineffectual. So if black wants to play the modern Philidor, and we go back to the position after h3, he should definitely avoid bishop b7 early and play b6, a6 and rook b8 first. Okay, well in Guzainov-Elyanov, white played bishop g5. Now if we think about the last example, let's consider knight h4, because this is a thematic idea in this particular line. Well, in the game Vasiescu versus Badea, played in Bucharest 2002, black took on d4, played knight c5, white played knight f5, but now black was able to take it, and what a difference that makes, because after e takes f5, d5, black is actually now very comfortable and may even hold slightly the better game. because the bishop on a2 is, for the time being, blocked out of the game. In fact, black went on to win this game in 28 moves. So it just shows you how important it is to take that nuance on board. Don't play bishop b7 early. Instead, c6, b6, a6, and then rook b8 is the correct move order. And after bishop g5, in Guzanov-Elianov, black got right on the case with b5. Alright, white took, black takes back with the a pawn. Now white played b4, hoping to freeze the black constellation on the queen side. Rook e8, a useful regrouping in the Philidor. White played rook b1, and now black played queen c7. Okay, the rook on e8 is protecting the bishop on e7. This is its main function. White tries the knight h4 idea. Black reacts in the centre. White recaptures, and now knight f8, another useful idea, threatening to come to e6, which forks the queen on d4 and the bishop on g5. So white moved away from the fork, and now bishop e6, bishop takes e6, f takes e6, completed the end of a comfortable opening for black. White's position looks impressive, but actually there are no penetration points in the black position to actually enter into. Black has good control over the queenside square c4, so black's plan might be knight d7 to b6 and then into c4. Black's centre, whilst backward, actually covers an awful lot of squares and denies white access to immediate access to black's position, and so I think black is perfectly satisfactorily placed here. White went queen g3, hoping to put some pressure on the king side. Black played knight d7, knight f3 happened, and now pawn up to e5, whereupon white went back to h4, hoping to make some capital of the fact that he can now play knight f5 in peace. Well, black hastened to exchange off the dark square bishops. Quite often in the Philidor, that signals the end of white pressure, and now black brought his knight into f4. An excellent move and a good outpost for the knight. Now, of course, if knight f5, black is also in shape to answer that with knight e6. Well, white went knight e2, black went knight e6 anyway. White went back with the queen, and now knight b6 is a continuation of the manoeuvre I mentioned earlier. That move b4 weakened the square c4, so black is ready to jump in there, and that's a beautiful outpost for the knight. Alright, queen to d3, trying to stay in touch with the centre situation, and black played rook b d8. Now black is ready to play d5 next move and expand. And while so far you might think that this was roughly an equal game, it's around here that white starts to go downhill a little bit, because he doesn't actually like the thought of black getting the initiative. Of course, d5 expanding in the centre is exactly the type of move black should be thinking about. He's gaining space, he's creating pressure on white's position, he's going for the initiative. So this is where black starts to get on top. White tries to pretend he's doing something on the A file. Black sacrifices a pawn, very interestingly, with queen f7. White grabs the pawn, and black comes in with knight f4. Well, that's a piece white's got to take in view of the pressure on e2, d3 and e4. Black takes that knight, and now he finds himself with hanging pieces. He can't take on d5 because of rook takes d5. Then the queen and the knight are forked. If he goes queen d1, as happened in the game, black takes on e4. White went queen g4, threatening knight h6 check. Black easily parried that with king into the corner. Queen takes f4, and now g6. And it's around here that white starts to play for tricks. Well, I think possibly time trouble was playing some sort of factor here. White went rook c7, queen takes f5. Now, of course, queen h6 is answered by rook d7. So, reluctantly, white took the queens off and played his other rook to the 7th rank, hoping to make a draw. Black was not interested in the draw. White gets some checks to be sure, but the point is that black runs his king to e8, and well, Elianov saw this position far-sightedly and decided to go for it. Now, what is white to do? You know, black is all ready to defend himself, so rook takes f5 was the move. Rook d1 check, king h2, and now the knight came back to d6. Rook came to h5, threatening checkmate, and now the relieving move, rook e7. Okay, white took this and played rook c5. Of course, on the face of it, it looks as though white's in reasonable shape, and he's got 3 pawns to the piece, but black is beautifully centralised, and well, he can put pressure on. You see, the point is, white can't really play king g3 in this position because of the beautiful move e3. That is the whole point of play. If rook c7, king d8, pawn takes pawn, knight e4 check. If rook e5, and this variation I like, king f6, rook takes e3, and now knight f5. A classic case of tactics working in favour of the man with a better position. So, king g1 was played, black brought his king up, pawn went to h4, rook d4, and now rook c4. And this is a move which actually wins the game. g4, e3 by black, f3, trying to retain pawns, rook f4. Now white has serious problems with the black e pawn, obviously. Rook king f1, trying to stop the e pawn by means of king e2, but then rook h3. And quite generously, from where I'm sitting, white decided to resign this position. Admittedly, his position is not that great. You know, black has ideas of, for instance, knight e4, making progress, but I'm not so sure I would have resigned this position. However, it is just a question of time before black manages to find a good square for his knight and then checks on h2. For instance, how about knight c4 and rook h2 as a plan? So, rather than play on, I decided to pack it in. A decent game by black, a very thematic game, steady all the way through, repelling the initial white attack, and then after, slowly taking over the position. My final game involving the early rook b8 is a rather sound affair. It comes from the St Vincent tournament in 2005, and it's between Ceratelli, graded 2342, and M. Fominic, graded 2335. Once again, we see the contours of the Philidor. The main line position is fast approaching. White goes rook e1, and now rook b8. Okay, after which white played bishop g5, yet another ninth move alternative. Now bishop a2 is one move I haven't considered. That's kind of a constructive waiting move. Against that, I think black should go ahead with the normal plan, which is b6. If then h3, a6, bishop e3, the point of h3 was to stop knight g4, of course. Then black goes through with b5, and if a takes b5, a takes b5, b4, which is a traditional reply fixing the queenside pawns, then queen c7 is a decent move. And if d5, then c5, and the bishop on a2 looks misplaced. So going back to the position after b6, d5 might be a better way of playing the position. Well, then comes e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and then knight f6. And if white wants to preserve the bishop pair, he's got to go bishop c4, after which bishop b7, and then the freeing break d5 gives black a decent position. Two lines convince us that this is the case. If e takes d5, white goes e4, and if bishop takes d5, black just simply takes that off with the bishop and goes e4 as well. In both cases, black is absolutely fine, of course. So going back to Ceratelli versus Fominic, bishop g5 was played. Black gave the bishop a prod with h6, and now played knight h7. I've stressed throughout this DVD the exchange of dark squared bishops tends to favour black, and well, quite simply here black is offering the exchange. If white takes on e7, queen takes, and white has nothing in this position. So white tried to keep the pieces on with bishop g3. Black played the knight up to g5. Knight takes on g5, bishop takes, d takes e5, d takes e5, and now queen came up to d3. For me, it's very doubtful whether white can maintain any advantage at all by these means, and queen e7 is just a very solid way to proceed. White brought her rook into the centre, Black did likewise, and now white played the only move she could see to make some progress here, queen d6. Then came another accurate move, a5, fixing dark squares on the queen side. The queens came off. Rook comes to e3. Bishop f6, a slightly surprising move, but black is protecting the pawn in preparation for knight c5. And after rook d6, white offered a draw, which was accepted. After bishop e6, of course, black has a very satisfactory position. So, summarising, I think rook b8 is a decent move. It's almost unknown. It's been only played in a few games. It's not mentioned in the leading Philidor book on the subject, and it will set white new problems. I'm not sure what more you could want. In the main line of the Philidor, some players might play their queen to e2. If they do this, I think black should change plans and try and exploit the unfortunate position of the queen on the e-file. Now, I've chosen the game Oral, Thomas Oral, graded 2460 versus Karol Mokry, graded 2505, to try and highlight what I mean. This game was played in the Czech Championship in 1996. Well, this is the main line position, and now white has to make a choice. In the game Oral versus Mokry, white played a4 first, black then played c6, and white played queen e2. Just dropping back for a moment, the immediate queen e2 has been played quite frequently, and after that I recommend it takes d4. And the point of this move is to get active immediately with knight takes d4, knight e5, bishop b3, and now c5. This is an interesting move, an interesting variation, which was discussed at length by Tony Coston in his excellent book on the Philidor, published by Batsford some time ago, and rediscussed by Grandmaster Christian Bauer in the Philidor files. They assess the position as unclear. I say, over the board, it's going to be easier for black to play. Well, white must continue with forcing play after this. Bishop takes f5, e takes f5, queen d7, and once again, white must force the pace, as black's simple threat of queen takes f5 will easily give him the better game if white just potters around. So f4 and then g4 has become established as the main line, and now black must again continue with energy and purpose. So d5 fits the bill. Black must even be prepared to sacrifice a piece in this position after g5 with the move c4, all as recommended by both Coston and Bauer. White takes on f6, black recaptures with the bishop, and white saves his piece by playing bishop a4, after which black takes on f5. And, you know, okay, black has two pawns for the piece, but white's king is wide open. Black has an imposing centre. Black's got ideas of knight d4. He's got ideas of rook e8. It won't be easy for white to defend this position. Now, let's just see the variation Bauer considers best here. Queen g2, basically keeping the queen out of range of the black pieces. But even here, black gets compensation after knight e7. And if knight d1, then b5 is a good move. Bishop takes b5, rook fb8, a4, a6, black's regaining his piece, knight e3, bishop d4, king h1, bishop takes e3, and then a takes b5, with an unclear position that somehow is a little better for black. All this occurred in a game between two unknown players in the Dutch league. Going back to the position after queen takes f5, other moves have also been played for white. For instance, my first thought when I was looking at this position initially was, why not take on c6? You know, you're a piece up, reduce material on the board. Well, it turns out after that black gets terrific play after rook e8, queen e4, and then bishop d4. This sequence leaves white all tied up. Going back to the position after queen takes f5, queen f3 has been suggested in some circles, after which black should play knight e7. If then knight d1, we have this tricky move b5 again, with the point that after bishop takes b5, we have rook fb8, bishop a4, and now rook b4, when it is unfavourable for white to try and see the piece with queen a3 in view of queen g6 check, king f2, bishop h4 check, king e2, knight f5, queen takes b4, knight d4 check. I mean, it's obvious that white is getting done over in this position. King d2, queen g2 check. And that move is just a killer. So, just from these short variations, I think we can immediately see that this is not at all an easy position for white to defend. One more try. What happens after rook e1? Well, then we have the excellent move, rook a e8. And if queen takes e8, black flicks in the Zwischenzug, queen g4 check. If then king f1, we have queen h3 check, and then bishop d4 check. And this will actually win the white queen, because after bishop e3, black simply goes rook takes e8, bishop takes d4, queen g4 check with advantage. All these variations mean that, going back all the way to queen e2, white's position after e takes d4 then knight e5 is not that easy. I think a lot of white players will only get into this variation by not knowing it really. They've simply blundered into this line, and I think you have every chance of catching them on the nose with this tricky line. Bishop takes and then queen d7. This looks a good practical bet for black to me. Which brings us back to oral versus mockery. White played a4, black played c6, and now oral put his queen on e2. There are a couple of other ways of doing this. White may try to retreat his bishop prophylactically to a2 before playing queen e2. After that we can go ahead with our standard plan, a6, and if rook d1, threatening, please note, to take twice on e5, then black has queen c7, d5, and then c5. When it's unclear who the block central position favours most, but that bishop on a2 looks misplaced to me. In general, black's plan in a position of this type is to try and advance his kingside pawns. So moves such as knight e8, g6, knight g7, and then f5 deserve very close consideration. Going back to the position after c6 one more time, white may try to cramp black on the queen side with a5. After this we revert to our normal plan of rook b8, and if queen e2 then, black can play b5 successfully. If white takes on b6 and plays d5, which is an idea we've seen constantly on this DVD, then black takes. Knight takes, bishop takes, knight f6, bishop c4, and now bishop b7, bishop d3, rook a8 with comfortable play. So now we have to come back to mockery, oral versus mockery one more time, and it's queen e2 that was played. Alright, now black changes plan, as I say, and makes the position much more fluid, less blocked by playing his rook to e8, and en passant sets a little trap. There are certain lines when white can demolish black completely with the idea bishop takes f7. This is not one of those positions. If king takes f7, queen c4 check, then black can play d5, and if he takes d5, simply knight b6 refutes the whole white setup. There's one more trick to contemplate. Can white get away with knight e6 in this position? It would be wonderful if he could. Well, I think black can just take that, and if queen c4, we go d5 again. White opens up for business, plays rook e1, but I think we just run away. King f7, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and then king f8 produces a position where, well, black has two extra pieces. So with the trick not working, oral played bishop g5. Just another one of those, how can I put it, moves which don't ruin the position but which don't really have any specific idea behind them. Anyway, knight d5 was mockery's excellent reply, forcing the exchange of dark squared bishops, but in black's favour because of the Zwischenzug knight takes c3. Oral tried queen f3 to keep his pawns together, but then came rook takes e7, queen takes c3. Obviously if b takes c3, knight e5 is good for black. Queen takes c3, and then rook takes e4, and out of nowhere black had actually won a pawn. Well, as is typical of these situations, you know, okay, white has blundered a pawn, but he can try to scratch up compensation. Oral played f3, rook e8, and now rook a e1. As long as the black queenside pieces remain undeveloped, then white might have some compensation. But Mokri cleverly and skillfully diffused the white initiative by trading on e1 and then playing the correct move, knight f8. Bishop a2 dropped away, bishop d7, a5, rook b8, and now white tries to stir up trouble by playing a6. He's trying to sacrifice a second pawn to break up the pawns on the queen side. Again, Mokri is on the ball and diffuses all the tricks with c5, which drives the knight away from the centre so that black can take on a6 in peace. Okay, knight f4, he's still trying to prove some compensation, get that knight into d5 and hope for the best. Queen g5, the first sign of real counterplay from black. Of course, it must be remembered black is 2 pawns up. Rook e8, safety. f4, some tricks, but queen d8, absolutely no tricks. When you're winning, you avoid complications, so swapping off fits the bill for Mokri. Queen g3, threatening knight f6 check. Knight g6, h4, bishop c6, excellent move, h5, and now the final passion killer, bishop takes d5. Bishop takes d5, knight e7, h6. I mean, I think actually that wasn't the best move. Probably white, if he wanted to stir up as much trouble as he could, should have tried queen e3. Okay, black is clearly better after queen d8, but it might not be that easy. But anyway, white went h6. I think he was probably getting desperate here, but I think he missed knight f5, and that garners yet another pawn. So it's not surprising the game finished quickly. Queen g5, knight takes h6, f5, last throw of the dice. In comes the queen. Queen h2, king h2, queen e5 check, king g1, and now the simple move queen f6. And after queen e3, queen d4 ended any resistance. The game lived to a finish. Takes, bishop e4 protecting pawn. Black frees up his king. King comes to f6. Takes another pawn, thank you very much. a5. And white came to his senses and resigned. He's no less than 4 pawns down in this position. So a good game by Mokri. And just summarising the game plan against queen e2, black must look for every opportunity to take advantage of the slight misplacement of the white queen. A good way to do this would be to put the rook on e8 and maybe to take on d4 as well. This gives black tactical chances. There are also additional tactical chances in the immediate line with queen e2 after e takes d4 and then knight e5 and c5. This does look promising in over the board practical terms. We've seen that the lion is a very solid opening, little used at club level and perhaps underestimated. I think you can use it in your own games with success, and if you